Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the War Report. And things just don't slow down around here. And we have a lot to cover. A lot of it is going to be speculation because that's all we can do. But of course, Ukraine is at the forefront of all our minds. Donald Trump is leading everyone around by the nose, if we're being honest, probably including people who should know better, which includes us. And we're all hanging on to every word that comes out of his mouth, everything he posts either on Twitter or Truth Social. That's what's the real important stuff is. But he's leading us all around by the nose. He's leading the entire world around the nose with it, making it. It's classic schizophrenic Trump, and I'm very eager to see what comes out of it because I do think there's concrete action on both sides, and we'll get into all of this, of course. But back in the news once again, less than 3 months, and it appears Syria may be reverting right
Yeah,
back to where it started. And
they're getting such a dose of democracy right now.
they are, hence the episode title, which I mean, okay, now I have to commit to it because I told you off air, and yeah, hey, it's done now. But less than 3 months, and I don't know. This might be just an uprising that is put down. This might be Jelani is allowed to do whatever he wants. But as we've seen before, this could very easily explode into yet another active civil war. Because right now it's a passive civil war. But I mean, this is exactly what they want for Syria. They want it to look like Iraq, look like Libya, where it's constantly fractured. Nobody can really get a foothold in. And like I said, we'll get into the details about that later. But without further
We did
ado,
say it would be like that.
yeah, we did, and I don't give us too much credit for that because I think anyone who's followed the situation for any amount of time could have told you that. But it seems like paying attention is the real superpower these days. Who would have thought? But without further
But by
ado,
the way,
yeah,
I
go ahead.
fact checked. I fact checked Trump. Spain is not in BRICS.
You, you know, I don't believe you. Okay, I'm gonna need to see some more evidence on that. Franco, I know for a fact he would have joined BRICS.
He would have, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, he was buddies. Well, maybe buddies isn't the right word, but he had a good working relationship with Castro. Fun fact.
Hmm.
And what's even more bizarre is that Maoist China was one of the first countries to recognize Pinochet. So Cold War politics, we should do a whole show on it. A lot more gray than one would originally think. But without further ado, I suppose we should actually get
Yes,
into the content of the show.
yes, we should. So, frontline news. The big things that are happening right now are in Kursk. And just before we began recording, there was a new map update from Scott Calibrated, which we'll put in at the tail end of reporting from Kursk. So the Ukrainians now control about 300 square miles. So it used to be about 1,000, so that they're down to like 30% of the territory that they control. Now, there was lots of speculation and rumors that the Ukrainians have already been pulling out of Kursk since the end of February. And you remember on the last show that you and I did, just you and I said that the Ukrainians have gone into Toretsk, and we'll get to Toretsk because right now they control roughly about 50% of the city. So there's a collapse going on in Toretsk, and my guess is that those forces that were in Kursk are being redeployed in Toretsk. Anyways, let's get to Kursk. So the first slide, this gives you an idea of the gains that the Russians have been making. All week, they've been making gains here. They've increased their control over the Ukrainian border, and they've also have this salient that is formed in the bottom part of the Ukrainian Kursk offensive. As you can see, it's outlined in black near the bottom. The next slide will give you kind of a better idea of the territories that were just gained. This is news. It's about 12, 14 hours old. Um, the
And for
Lipnia
context,
River,
we're recording the evening of not February, March 8th, 2025.
that's right. So here we're looking at a bit of a close up to get a better idea of just the Kursk offensive itself, and not necessarily in relation to Russia. Uh, so you can see that the Russians have expanded the red outline, the black outlines, the orange blob that you see there. That is the Russians going into the Sumy region. And if you go to the next slide, you can see the area that the Russians have also taken further north. Um, Viktorovka is a town that they've captured. Now, when you look at this slide, you see the town of Maloloknia, right? Maloloknia has a river and a railroad that goes through it, and that is what you see, this winding thing that goes all the way into the Sumy region. But more importantly, you'll see in the next slide is that there is only one road. So basically, I've outlined in the Kursk area where Suja is, and in the other area, if you follow the line where it terminates in the bottom left-hand corner, that is where Sumy, the city is, or the next big town next to Sumy. Those salients by the Russians that they gained in the past 72 hours are only 10 kilometers apart, and there is only one road in and out. Now, the thing is that the Russians already accomplished this like a day or two ago. Um, so it was inevitable. Remember, on the last few episodes, I've been saying that the road of life leading into Kursk from Ukraine is coming to look like the road that led into Bakhmut. And so now there's very few ways to resupply the troops in Kursk, and that's why they've begun the evacuation. Right now, the Western media will spin it like this is because Blumf, stopped sharing intelligence. I mean, everybody understands that most of the intelligence that the Ukrainians received was from the Americans, but um, we also discussed that there are approximately 600 satellites giving Ukraine information. Over, a dozen AWACS planes constantly flying around in the Black Sea, hugging around Belarus, flying by Western Ukraine. So all the other countries, all the other 32 or 33 countries of NATO, they're still, helping Ukraine, right? And my guess is that the Americans have offloaded all of this to to their NATO partners in order to very publicly give Russia a carrot. The other bit of news, of course, is that the Russians have been hitting the Ukrainians with night strikes. Now, most of them are all like most of the implementation to do this are drones. They're not ballistic missiles. Okay. Uh, of the last strike, which I believe was on Thursday, there were 194. Of the 90 of the 194, over 130 were drones. So not really that many ballistic missiles. Okay. No, Russia might be having a shortage. There might be all kinds of reasons. I don't know, but it's not. We've had numbers of 170, 180, 190 before, but the split has been more even or favored missiles over drones. Okay. That said, it has been, there's been a lot of news. Odessa has been hit. But the big news is Kryvyi Rog was hit, I believe, on Wednesday. And they hit like a little well, not little, but it's a 3-story hotel or a building of some kind where mercenaries were put up. And of course, the Ukrainians say, 2 injured, 1 dead, or something like that. But the first few videos I saw, you could see men in military uniforms. Uh, I saw at least one in a military uniform, and that would imply that the military was using civilian areas. And I would say maybe probably both sides are, but the Ukrainians definitely have always used civilian areas because they understand that they're at a disadvantage, and maybe they don't I don't know, maybe they feel there's no other option. In any case, so they got hit. There was also a training camp that was hit, and the Ukrainians said on BBC that 32 killed. The Russians claim 5 times more. I've seen the video. It's very hard to tell. The Russians used a cluster munition from an Iskander, and I'm guessing, a lot of people died. Was it 32? Was it 150? Was it 70? I don't know, but it's going to be a lot. Um, and usually one of the things that we unfortunately have seen is the Russians being more susceptible to this than the Ukrainians, and that has to do with intelligence, right? In any case, so the Ukrainians were hit this way, and of course the news now, of course, is panicking in Western media that Russia can't be trusted. How are we going to ever? I mean, look, the EU, Ukraine, and Russia, none of them are interested in a ceasefire. The only one that's interested in a ceasefire right now is Trump, and his reasons aren't noble. His reasons are because um, America's overextended, and they have other bigger priorities,
I
even though that might be unimaginable for many people, and I can understand that. But there are many fires that are lit right now, and America simply cannot put them all out. So they're abandoning Ukraine
no, and
to
you're
to a
right.
degree,
You're
to a degree,
you're
to a
right.
degree.
And it seems like the only two countries, and this is going to be a shock to no one, that are interested in actually brokering some sort of lasting peace with this, where Ukraine somewhat remains intact, and returning to a somewhat status quo, except maybe uh, trying to smooth over some tensions, are Hungary and Slovakia. That's those are the only two. It's
Mhm.
not even like, and I know that Serbia is under various political pressures right now, but you're not even seeing that kind of talk out of Serbia. It's Orban, it's Fico. That's all you have.
Yeah.
Trump wants a tactical retreat from Ukraine in order to focus on other theaters, as you said. The Europeans are doubling down on this because they know their last hope of relevance in an American-led world lies in Ukraine.
Yeah.
And the Russians, what reason do they have to enter into ceasefire? What reason do they have to enter into any serious negotiations? Because for now, the losses are tolerable. The cost of the war is tolerable to both the Russian state and the Russian public. And if things continue on as they are, they're going to be able to dictate terms to Kiev however they want.
Yes. And I suppose the other thing we should remember is that last year Putin already outlined what his terms were. So all this talk, there aren't any real negotiations occurring right now over the fate of Ukraine. We discussed in the show that most of the talks about are reestablishing communications with the Americans, their embassies, and the bigger picture for the security for Europe. Uh, I don't know what was discussed in Turkey, um, but a lot of it is also dependent on, let's say, what the EU and Zelensky decide. Um, but to get back to my point about Putin, he already said we get the four oblasts, their entirety, their legal borders, including the cities of Kherson and Zaporozhye, and demilitarization, withdrawing of all Ukrainian forces, denazification. Um, and of course, this Nazification is only like anti-Russian. It's everybody understands that now, but you know the uh, the Russians are the other party here. To them, it matters, and they don't really care if you think that's not the right definition of Nazism.
Yes, and
So,
I was actually going to clarify. As far as the Russians are concerned, denazification is regime change. Not just Zelensky gone, but the entire Maidan government gone. Uh,
yes,
Restart,
yes,
probably draft a new constitution at that point. And yes, they'll employ rhetoric to appeal both to their populations and certain populations abroad. But at the end of the day, if you want the actual definition of renazification that the Russians are using, it is a departure of the Maidan government in its entirety.
Yes, yes. Yeah, so so he's already outlined all of this, and I, Lavrov today reiterated uh, what are the terms of agreement for the Russians. The terms of agreement for Ukraine seem for the Russians to be ironclad. Probably where the Russians would give up some of their goals would be, let's say, where NATO puts its missiles, because they have to presume that, after Trump is gone, we don't know what will happen. And those missiles, especially if they're in submarines or mobile units, they can always be moved, and they probably will be moved. Maybe even in Trump's time in office.
Yes, and to further that point, in my opinion, the entire purpose of the talks in Saudi Arabia and Turkey, they do have to do with the normalization of U.S.-Russian relations, which will handle those issues separately from Ukraine, and that Trump, to his credit, is not going to tie those issues together of broader strategic implications and the particular situation of how to settle the Ukraine conflict. And I mean, you're already
Mhm.
getting talk of wanting to move U.S. troops from Germany into Poland and reducing the American presence in Germany down to 35,000. Some people speculate Hungary. I don't think Orban would go for it. I mean, he's trying to jail former USAID collaborators. That's one of the things he announced today. It would be Poland. Who are we kidding?
Yes.
A lot of that is up in the air, and that yes, the Russians probably will make some concessions, as you said, particularly when it comes to Ukraine. They will sacrifice some broader strategic goals for the time being, as you were saying, with missile placements, probably in Poland or Romania in particular, because those are issues that can be solved in a different time, in a different format, where Ukraine needs to be solved in and of itself in its entirety. It is separate from those negotiations. And a lot of people, even on our side, even a lot of people who think have very good analysis, want to conflate negotiations for renormalization of relations and the Ukraine conflict.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. Now, if we return back to Kursk, of course, the other big news that just happened today, a few hours ago, is that the Russians have managed to walk 12 kilometers behind enemy lines by using a pipeline that was recently turned off after the contract between between Ukraine and Russia ended. Lots of videos on this as confirmation. The next slide will show you essentially the route of the pipeline and how it terminated in I guess, inside the Kursk held area by the Ukrainians. Um, and then just the last bit of news for Kursk. You can see that, yeah, from this is from Scott. I've titled it "Latest Kursk Suja News." So the Russians have just captured at least three new villages: Mihailovka, Martinovka, Ruskoye, and Cherkasoye. Um, so they're pushing closer into Sucha. Of course, I'm not slagging Scott. His maps tend to be pretty accurate. I'm just saying we'll see, but this is quite a push. And some of the other mappers, like Weeb Union, who's usually more conservative. Of course, he also doesn't live in the States. He's not in North America like we are. He's in Denmark, so the news comes differently there. When Scott published this, I'm sure that Weeb Union was already asleep. And just so people know that these slides are from Weeb Union's channel. Uh, now we move to Chasov Yar. And this is a place that has been in a stalemate for quite some time. We've discussed many times about the urban center and this industrial plant that the Ukrainians are holed up in. It's uncertain how they're getting supplies. We don't know whether they stockpiled a lot of supplies or there's some other route. But you can see in the blow up map that there is a water reservoir, and you can see that the Russians took several blocks here and basically have cut off one of the routes going in. So the Ukrainians would have to go through this forested area, looping around the territory where the Russians have gained and around the water reservoir, and then sneak into that complex in blue that is next to the water reservoir to the right of it. So, anyways, developments happening in Chasov Yar. The next frontline news is Kupiansk. The Ukrainians this week had some successful counterattacks, and the Russians have had some success themselves. Um, I didn't include the new territories that the Russians include. I didn't include new territories that the Russians gained north of this area. Okay, it's another crossing over the Oskal River, but it is very small. I know there is some strategic and tactical significance to it, but for the sake of the show, there's only so much I can reveal here. You know, so the next slide will show you the territories that the Ukrainians gained a couple of days ago. You can see it's around Sinkovka, or between Sinkovka and Kupiansk. It's outlined in that pale yellow, and north of it, in outline in red, is the territory that the Russians have gained. And the next slide gives you kind of like a better overall idea of Kupiansk, the successful Ukrainian counterattack, the outlines in red and black of the Russians. The thing to keep in mind is that forested area in the orange or red color, everything on the left side, the Russians didn't have until like the end of 2024. Now we move to Toretsk and what is looking like for the Russians a very, very difficult time. So it looks like, remember when I brought up Toretsk, I said if the Ukrainians put in a lot of men and they're able to overcome the Russians, this is presupposing that there are not a lot of troops in Toretsk, then this will work out for them. And you can see that, like, I imagined that that whole tip going on a northwestern trajectory could collapse. The Russians have a Terracon there. They, of course, never completely controlled the other two Terracons, which gave the Ukrainians an advantage. But you can see the other Terracon to the left, in a big swath of an area. They lost that, and so now, like, Toretsk is collapsing, and the Russians could lose another huge chunk. So this is why I believe that sometime in late to mid February, Ukraine was already moving troops out of Kursk. And I mean, I don't know if people understand, like, you can't just rush out of an area that's, 300-400 square miles. For one, you'll be spotted. And number two, I've already seen videos of convoys of the Ukrainians getting hit. There was a convoy of 8 armored vehicles that were hit, men running through the forest. There have been Ukrainian soldiers that were captured. Uh, there are stories of mass surrenders, but I mean, we've heard of mass surrenders all the time. There's only 2 times where there were like real mass surrenders, and of course, the first one was Mariupol, where between 2,400 to 2,500 Ukrainians surrendered, and to a lesser extent, a few. Well, okay, if we include Avdiivka, which had about 800 to 900, and then Lysychansk, which had about 300, then yes, those were the big ones. But Mariupol was, leagues ahead, right? I don't know if that's the case with Kursk. It's just one of those things. We're not on the ground, so we'll wait and see and to find out. Next area that we're going to look at is Pokrovsk. And the Ukrainians have been very successful here, holding off the Russians from moving further north and west from their northern salient. Um, the the Ukrainians have recaptured Udachne. The Russians are still holding on to Kotlyine. Um, and there's heavy fighting over in Shevchenko, which has been going kind of back and forth. So yes, so the next slide will show you where Udachny is. I've outlined that. This is an earlier map. Um, yes, so you can see that now. Unfortunately, the map that I have below here, I don't think is from today, so I'm just going to delete it. Um, okay, so that's what's going on in the northern front of Pokrovsk. Now we move to the southern front of Pokrovsk, which is around the Andreevka area. The Russians captured Andreevka in the earlier part of the week, and there's been intense fighting over Constantinople. The Russians gained about two-thirds of it, then they lost some of it, and now there's a very heavy back and forth. The Russians increased their control over the trenches and the bulwarks that are north of this area that I'm talking about. That's that red square that you see at the top of the screen. And the outlines of black and blue is where the fighting for Constantinople is taking place. At the bottom, you can see the Russians also gained territories and farm fields in the southern part towards the Velika Novoselka. The next slide will show you the territory that the Russians gained over the trench networks, and you'll see a bit of the territories that have gone back and forth in Constantinople. So yeah, the Ukrainians have been very successful, I would say, the last week and a half in being able to deter the Russians in this area. The Russians are moving; they're moving at a slower pace, however. The next slide will, well, actually, we can ignore the next slide because it's kind of redundant. But the slide after, you'll see that the Ukrainians have almost completely regained control of Constantinople. Yeah, there it is. And this slide, you'll see that what the Russian objective essentially is. Um, they're trying to go through for this heavy trench network and the town of Bagatir. Um, as you can see, they want to close this area. This is why Constantinople is so important, because the Russians have already captured Andreevka. They've already captured the trench networks above it, and so to move forward again, they have to close this gap. Finally, we move to Velika Novoselka. And I've outlined in red where Velika Novoselka is, and just look at the amount of territory in every direction that the Russians have gained. Right? It is massive. It isn't like anything to sneeze at. There were some small gains that the Russians made north of the big red part that I circled, um, and that gets to the riverfront. Now, the next two slides are basically what the strategy is for this area of the front. So the Russians are going to continue moving westward because it's less defended. Um, and they're going to try to capture these areas that you see in the Zaporozhye region, like Novopavlovka, for instance. Uh, Mezhova is another town that they want to capture. You can see where it is in relation to Pokrovsk, which is the big circle. Because anything on the right side, on the east side, you can see this very heavy trench networks, but not so much in this other area. The thing that the Russians have to be careful, of course, is these are wide open areas, and we are in the drone warfare era. And one of the reasons why the Russians are having trouble surrounding Pokrovsk is they have very few towns that they can use their drone operators, kind of like what the Russians experienced in that part of Lugansk and the Kharkov Oblast, where I mentioned many times that when you're operating drones and you have a big town, you're much more safer than drone operators that have to either work in the field or in towns further away. And so this gives the advantage over the Ukrainians. And that's why I think Pokrovsk will be very difficult. My guess is the Ukrainians will put everything they've got into defending Pokrovsk. Toretsk might even be like a diversion to split the Russian forces. We'll have to see what happens with regards to the Kursk collapse, if there is a collapse. As I said, they've lost 700 square kilometers since September. And if there is a collapse, that will free up Russian units. So just some things to keep in mind. Anyways, that's it for the map update.
Well, very good and very thorough as always. But I did want
Thanks.
to speculate on the situation in Pokrovsk and Toretsk just a moment before we get into some of the broader news surrounding Ukraine. And that is, as you've been saying, there seems to have been a small organized retreat from the Kursk Oblast in order to reinforce other fronts and actually go on the counteroffensive on other fronts as well. And given the storm in the media, the storm around support for Ukraine, the division between the European establishment and the American establishment, so on and so forth, when these kind of tensions arise, what I have noticed since this war has broken out, the Ukrainians are always very eager to score victory, something they can take to their backers, and possibly even Trump in this case, showing this war is winnable. We are gaining ground. We are defending our country. There is a chance to beat the Russians, etc., etc. Maybe not even necessarily Trump, but just their backers in general. Something to reinforce the people who have poured billions upon billions of dollars in resources into this war. And Pokrovsk, I think, I'm, I, it's not a matter of opinion. It's a matter of fact that it is the last line of defense in the Donbass before the Russians, more or less at that point, have an ability to drive to the river if they want to. And as we've seen, it doesn't seem like the Ukrainians have been setting up further entrenchments beyond Pokrovsk, beyond this massive defensive line that they have in the Donbass, and that there's really no plan once Pokrovsk falls. And that Kursk, while it was a great PR stunt, while they did manage to tie up some Russian forces, it proved to be, once again, a side project. And they need those troops. They need them in Pokrovsk. They need to delay the Russian advance as long as possible, especially now that American aid isn't cut off. I know it's been going back and forth, but it's much more uncertain. Even if Trump does eventually support Ukraine in some capacity, whether he does it directly, whether it is through the Europeans, Ukraine has lost valuable time and resources in all this deliberation, and
Hmm.
what they receive will likely not be what they as much or as significant as what they would have received during the first 2 years of the war. So, in a way, I do think they are preparing for the worst, and they are wanting to dig their heels in because this is going to be their last chance, in my opinion at least, looking at the front line of a real conventional defense, at least on the Donbass front. We'll see what happens in the north. We'll see what happens in the south near Kherson. But as far as the main front of this war, which is the Donbass front, they are going to dig their heels in, and they are probably willing to sacrifice more men than they did even in Bakhmut or Avdiivka at that point. I think it's going to, and this might be sensationalist on my part, but looking at the build up to this battle, it's probably going to be the most significant battle of the war to this point. It's and like I said, I bring up
Yep.
Avdiivka and Bakhmut because those are the only two comparisons I can make at this point.
Yeah, I think that's very well put. Um, Pokrovsk will be it, and you can see the foolishness of going for Kursk, right? Kursk is turning into nothing, and the Russians, which had a very slow year in 2024, they gained something like 5,000 square kilometers, but three of the 5,000 were gained like between August like literally the day after Kursk and up until December 31st,
No, but because
right?
they didn't take the bait, and the Ukrainians were
Yes,
so
yes.
reliant on that. And while we have repeatedly said if this war goes on long enough, barring a black swan event, the Russians will eventually win, Ukraine's little safari in Kursk cost them valuable months. They could have delayed this Russian advance through the Donbass probably for another 2 or 3 months had they held their ground, had they not bothered with Kursk. Now, you could make the argument the Russians were going to open up another front near Sumy, and that may have been possible, but I don't think the Russians were going to divert the forces from the pitched battles, especially at that point. If my memory serves me correctly, we're talking late July into early August. I think it was August 6th when the Kursk offensive started. You had battles like Chasov Yar going on, where it was a very pitched battle. Neither side was making much progress, and it just wasn't going to. Let me put it this way: it would the front line probably would have looked like that for the rest of the year, and the gains probably would have been marginal, minimal, had things continued on the status quo. Unless the Russians really were planning some quote unquote big air offensive, which we've gone into a number of times. Big air offensives are nearly impossible in the modern age. Uh, but this entire adventure was ultimately, in my opinion, to either capture the power plant as some sort of blackmail tactic, or B, get permission for the long range missiles. And we saw what the long range missiles did nothing. They made
Mm-hmm.
no impact. In fact, they actually worked against Ukraine because the Russians are now much more willing to use heavier weapons, as we saw with the Orezhnik attacks. They are willing to employ the more experimental weapons. They're willing to climb that escalation ladder just as much as the Ukrainians and their backers. So everything everything they did was counterintuitive in Kursk. And the only argument you could make from a quote unquote pro Ukrainian perspective is they got to commit reprisals against ethnic Russians living in Kursk. That's the only thing they
Yeah.
accomplished. And
Yes.
that didn't wear down Russian morale. In fact, it steeled it. So there was no benefit. This was a complete disaster. If the Ukrainians had any sense or any viable replacement, Syrski should be out of a job tomorrow. He should have been out of a job a long time ago. But
Mm-hmm.
there's just no
But
there's
it was the British that convinced him to do this. Just like using the storm shadows against the Russians, just like Kursk, just like the attacks on the Kerch Bridge, the British have been pivotal in this.
oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
So on that note, do you think this idea came from Zaluzhny? Do you think it came through?
I don't think so. Zelensky's not an idiot. I mean, the reason they got rid of Zelensky is because he was too much of a realist.
Yeah, I agree, but because you brought the British, I felt like the question had to be asked. I would agree, but I was just
Mm.
genuinely curious about your opinion on that. But you're right. It's because he wouldn't have gone along with these kind of things. And had he stayed in power, I mean, the reason they got rid of him is because he's too much of a threat to Zelensky. It's that simple. But
Right, but I'm saying just before that happened,
yes,
right? Just before they got rid of him, when there was nothing to suggest, I mean, nothing that we could um 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 perceive that he wanted a political career. He was a general. He was a general over the entire military, not just the ground forces. Of course, Ukraine only has essentially ground forces. They have a tiny, a non-existent navy, and an air force that was, barely bigger than Assad's. And I mean, there was nothing at that time to suggest that he was interested in a political career. And um, I think already there was this idea because the Kursk, sorry, the Ukrainian spring counteroffensive of 23 was not going well, and he already made those comments in late 2022 and early 2023 in January that this is the time to sue for peace and to freeze the conflict. That was very unpopular, and I imagine it would have been unpopular even with the British, who I suppose look at him as a kind of investment in future Ukraine, in future like Russia destabilization programs. And I think that's why they canned him. Now, of course, he was very popular. Of course, Zelensky did have reasons to fear him on a political level. I'm just saying it was a period of time, wasn't very long, where there was no indication that he was interested in going into politics. The war was still raging. It was only after he was demoted, like, he was forced to leave, essentially. That's what happened. And that's when you heard the political talk, if I remember correctly. That's when the political talk came up. But that was his way of trying to get back into Ukraine to leave his job as ambassador, right? And anyways, Sirski was a horrible choice. I mean, Zelensky was a guy that I was afraid of. As a Vatnik, I was afraid of him. So
Oh, I agree. He was a competent commander, and
yeah,
he had the respect of his troops. And like I said, you can find what he believes in, what he fights for wrong. You don't have to like it, but he was
yeah,
good at his job, and that's undeniable.
yes, absolutely.
He was the man for the job, and they sacked him for political reasons. But speaking of the political intrigue, I suppose we should move on to just the flurry around Trump, the fallout from the meeting,
Yes.
Europe continuing their kids' tables meetings, and just all of the nonsense that has
Oh
ensued.
my God.
And cutting through all of the noise, getting to the actual significant stories. I think the most significant non-frontline story is that Trump has allegedly, I haven't seen the concrete proof on this, has allegedly opened up contact with several Ukrainian opposition figures, including Poroshenko and Timoshenko.
But what's funny is like these guys who are interested in like, I mean, they're kind of on board. They're just like a different kind of Zelensky.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. I'm not. Yeah, absolutely. You're not going to get any fight back, any pushback from me on that. But
Yeah, I didn't want to sound too like I wasn't directing it at you if I sounded too critical
no,
or
yeah,
or
he
uh,
treats me.
contradictory.
He treats me so poorly on the show. I don't know. I keep him around, but but yeah, I completely agree that it's not going to be any major departure. But I did think it's interesting because I speculated about this a little bit with Israel, and I thought the possibility might exist with Ukraine where they do at least have a change of face in terms of leadership. Where Trump, because of his personal frictions with either Netanyahu or in this case Zelensky, may push for some sort of at least change in management. Not necessarily change in regime, but just somebody new at the helm. And
Mm,
I think what this might be, I think it might be part of a negotiating tactic, telling Zelensky that he can either come to the table or we're going to push for elections, we're going to push for your resignation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Look, we're already talking to Poroshenko, we're talking to Timoshenko, we're talking to probably the most viable opposition figures that could actually unseat you. And of course, Trump has bloviating with on Truth Social about, well, if Russia keeps winning so hard, we're just going to have to sanction them. We're going to have to put sanctions on the banking sector. We're going to have to tariff them because once again, what else are they left to do except more tariffs, more sanctions,
hmm
which will not work, by the way. But looking at all the news that's floated around, such as the supposed suspension in intelligence sharing, the uh, supposed suspension of aid to Ukraine, cutting it off after the big blow up with Zelensky. To go back to your point, to go back to a point that we've made several times on the show, this does look like a way of, for the sake of the American public, for the sake of the media cycle, putting away American support for Ukraine, yet continuing it via Europe. Or if we want to go
hmm
take that to its logical conclusion, which I'm not completely sold on, but I do think has some merit, the document that Hegseth was involved in writing, where there is a division of labor on the question of Russia and China,
Yeah.
where the Europeans continue the proxy war against Russia, while the Americans set their sight on China. And I do think, like I said, that may be the case. I don't know if that's concretely the plan yet, but it's reasonable to assume that some form of that is happening, even if there are genuine overtures towards the Russians right now. And I'll get into what I think that Trump is doing with Russia in just a moment here. If you do you have a thought on that then?
Yeah, I do. Like, I think this is a bit of a carrot and stick situation, right? Um, here's what I mean. When it came into the news yesterday and today about just how severe these strikes on energy infrastructure have been happening in the last, let's say, 48, 72 hours in Ukraine by the Russians, right? And there have been some fatalities, although when you consider just how many fatalities, right, like they're very low. If you believe that when they say people, they always mean civilians and they don't mean um, military. So one of the decisions that Trump made is he took 35,000 troops out of Germany and put them into Poland. Right? Obviously, that's a sign. Like, Trump wants this war to end quickly for strategic reasons. Right? He's not. How can I put it? But he doesn't have a lot of cards to play, and he has to signal to the Russians to hurry up. But the Russians are not motivated to hurry up. There's no reason for them to hurry up, and he doesn't have whatever it is um, that he could persuade them for him to achieve all his goals, right? And some of those goals are not just ending the war in Ukraine, but to pry Russia from China, right? Of course, if you like, him wanting to get out of Ukraine would mean on some level he's ready for the next phase. Is the next phase Iran rather than China? Is it an interdiction somewhere else we're not thinking about? Is it Indonesia? Um, we don't know, right? For sure. Definitely, Iran is the weak link. So that would make sense. But he's in a rush. Everybody else is not. Of course, I would say for the Ukrainians, like for the average Ukrainian, like they are kind of in a rush. They too, like, I'm talking about the civilians. I know there's many civilians that are not going to be happy with this, but they don't really have a lot of choice. And the fact of the matter is you know for 8 years it didn't, like, for them it's completely legitimate to have a coup. For them it's completely legitimate to ignore a president who is saying we'll do re-elections. Okay, I did it before, I did the re-election, I lost, you had a new president, and then I won the next time. uh at least, in fairness to him, he is willing to cooperate. In any case, uh these people, a lot of them, they volunteered for this. For them, shelling the Donbass for 8 years was completely okay, right? Well, I mean, okay, maybe it is okay, but you're dealing with Russia, right? And I do have a very interesting quote by someone posted this on one of the YouTube channels in reference to the war in Ukraine. Please bear with me. I'll as I look for it.
But
But
to touch on your
th- go ahead, go ahead.
to touch on your point while you're looking for that, yes, many of the Ukrainians were eager to go along with this. Many of them thought that with proper American backing, they would be able to humiliate the Russians. And
Yes, and they dreamt of that. They
yes,
dreamt of
they
that.
they did. And to touch on your point, while on the surface, I think a lot of the Ukrainians, even among the civilian population, would say we can still hold out so long as we get our aid packages from the West. I think even subconsciously, the vast majority of the population of Ukraine knows, the ones who aren't frothing at the mouth banderites, know that this war is a lost prospect and that any hope of preserving their country exists in negotiation. Even if there's probably some of them who will go to their grave never admitting that, but I
Yes.
do think a plurality of the population, at least, understands that fact.
Yeah, I mean, their country really is a religion. It really has become a religion. But I found the quote. Ukraine's fate was already predicted more than 2,000 years ago by a famous Chinese philosopher. Quote, if a country is small but not humble, if it is weak but not wary of the strong, if it is disrespectful and insults its large neighbors, if it is greedy, arrogant, and undiplomatic, it will perish. Fan Han Fei, 280 BC. Right? And America has always relied on these kinds of these kinds of people in these kinds of countries.
Yes.
They've always relied on these kinds of people.
They, I think that sums it up perfectly. That it and what's even
This is why they can ditch them later.
oh, absolutely. And what's even worse about it in this situation is that Ukraine, like, if you're talking in terms of geography, you're talking in terms of resources, was not a small country, but it was governed like a small, arrogant country. It didn't have to
Yes.
be this way. Looking
Yes.
at what they had to work with post independence, post 1991, they think their population was about 40 million upon the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, look, I understand there's a lot of social and economic problems. Not going to downplay those. They inherited, even minus the vaunted nuclear weapons that they want so much, they inherited sizable military stockpiles. Like I said, natural resources industry. Uh, they could have been had they had more competent leadership. And like I said, I know it was a difficult time, but the Russians recovered. Um, a lot of other post-Soviet states managed to recover, and even if they would have taken some hits in 2000 in the 90s, they could have went down a similar path of recovery. So it didn't have to be this way. Ukraine probably, had they played all their cards right, had everything gone right for them, ideally they could have been another Turkey. They could have been another bridge between East and West, a country that is able to constantly play off both sides. But
Mhm.
that's gone. That's never coming back. And for the Ukrainian people, for the ones who actually have an understanding of statehood and statecraft and what it means to be a sovereign state, it's it's tragic for them because
Yeah.
they could have been a decent secondary, tertiary power. They wouldn't have been on the level of, say, some of the Western European states back when they could actually control themselves, or, but like I said, I could have seen them being a parallel to maybe, to a lesser extent, of a country like Turkey. And it, like I said, that situation is completely gone now. And to touch on your point, to go back to Trump's media circus, because yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. But like, in not only Ukraine, but you see this in the Baltic states. You see this to an extent in Poland and Romania. Just
You see it in the Balkans, especially with Albania.
yeah, don't, especially I can't actually can't think of a better example than Albania, really.
I know.
And the real question is, how does Albania still continue their pledge of support to Ukraine? Because that's the most important thing. You
Mm.
know, where do the Albanians stand? Okay, we need to know that they should be head of NATO for now and for all time. Okay, that's that is the only hope that I've been listening too much to Gunther Fehlinger. I think he's implanted
Mm.
terrible pro-Albanian ideas into my head, but I'm getting derailed here. My apologies. But to return to your point about Trump's grand strategy vis-a-vis the Russians, so far through his rhetoric and through his actions, has accomplished one vital thing. He has effectively driven a wedge between the Europeans and the Russians that doesn't look like it's going to be uh, mended anytime soon. He has driven them apart because at this point, the Europeans, especially the current leadership class, think the Macrons, the Starmers, the Mertzes, Maloney's, of course, they see their prospects once again in maintaining American interest in Ukraine in order to keep American leadership in Europe, in order to maintain the positions as vassals of the empire. As they see it now, their overlords are going away, so they're left to pick up the pieces. Therefore, they're unable to construct a united front. And I think probably the biggest indicator they don't actually view the Russians as an existential threat is that they can't form a united front, that they're still bickering over who gets to do what and how the situation is going to be handled. which doesn't read as an existential crisis if they have the time for these sort of petty squabbles.
Yeah,
But
yeah, yeah, yeah.
but as it
It's always an emergency,
yeah,
except it's not.
of course, of course. But to continue on with my point, you're not going to get what you got 10 years ago. Macron is not going to call Putin and offer to enter negotiations and normalization relations. Schultz and now Merz, who's going to be coming into office, not going to do that. Starmer certainly is not going to do that. The Italians will go whatever the way the wind blows. They're the weakest of the Western European powers. They don't really have much diplomatic leverage as it stands, so it's not really surprising the way they went. But realistically, especially if Trump's strategy is what I think it is, the most quote unquote independent actions the Europeans could take is to launch into negotiations of their own with Russia. But they're not going to do that. And he's not responsible for it entirely, but he has effectively exploited the wedge that already exists between Russia and Europe, and those relations are not likely to be repaired. So you have the Russians cut off from that front, and now he's going to try and probably fail to work to cleave them away from the Chinese. And to touch on the point with the Iranians, there was all the speculations, all the rumor mills about Russia playing intermediary between America and Iran to the point where America's trying to diplomatically pacify the Iranians. Probably once again also
Good
trying.
luck.
It's yeah. It's I don't know. Maybe with Pezeshkian, who knows what that man will agree to. Who knows what humiliation ritual
Sure.
he would undergo? But at that point, I don't know. Maybe I'm too. Maybe I give them too much credit, but I think at that point the IRGC would just stage a coup and take over the country themselves, which arguably at this point, maybe they should have done already with some of the. And I won't go too far into the question of Iranian leadership, but like I said, there's a reason they killed Soleimani. It wasn't just military reasons; it was political reasons too. They feared that man leading Iran, and I will stick to that probably for the entirety
Mm,
of the time I do this
mm.
show. They killed Soleimani because they feared that he could be a strong man in charge of a secondary power. And they
Yes.
preferred, as much as they go on about them, they preferred the ossified leadership that's currently in power. And I'm not going to, like I said, I'm not going to dwell on the question of Iranian leadership too long for this moment. But yes, I think we're starting to get beyond the theatrics, beyond the Trumpisms. We're starting to get a clearer picture of what American strategy under Trump looks like in terms of not only Russia, but the globe. And that does seem where, like I said, he already has exploited that divide between Russia and Europe. They're not going to have a reunion anytime soon. Not that I can see, unless there's some sort of major, like, I'm talking political revolution overnight in Europe. And now it just comes to trying to peel the Russians and the Chinese away from each other, which is a much more difficult prospect that the U.S. simply does not have the means to do, whether when it comes to diplomatic capital, political capital, economic capital. It just simply does not exist, which will probably, when that fails to happen, and we're already seeing at least some implicit anticipation of that, where they are trying to fortify North America. Trump is continuing his pressure on Canada, and to a lesser extent his pressure on Mexico, to try to form the quote-unquote North American fortress. And as far as Latin America is concerned, we'll probably see Trump set his sights on there to root out, I guess you could say, the Chinese influence in places, say, like Venezuela. The whole politics around the Panama Canal, as we were talking about. Of course, he's on very good terms with our favorite Argentinian. But no, I'm not talking about that one. He's probably long dead at this point. but
Yeah.
but there'll probably
That was
be,
brilliant.
yes, there'll probably be some shenanigans in Brazil to get a more
Oh yeah.
Trumpian, and maybe not even Bolsonaro, because Bolsonaro was he talked a big game on China, but we and yes, he did take some anti-Chinese actions, but especially with his relationship with the Russians, Bolsonaro was a little bit of an unknown quantity. He was a bit of a rogue. Now, of course, he was pro-Israel. He was very pro-Trump, so there was all of that. But I imagine they could probably go for a little bit more of a compliant figure in Brazil, if we're talking about that. And they would be the BRIC state to cleave away out of the principal BRIC states. And to tie this back around while we're talking about Trump's grand strategy, while in principle I can commend what Trump is doing in South Africa with the demographic situation with the Afrikaners. uh, the devil is in the details of that one. And like I said, my full sympathy and support to these people. I'm of the opinion that the project is dead. You should get the hell out, go wherever you can, except South Africa. And that's, I mean, like I said, that's just my opinion. And I know there's a lot of people who will live and die by their land, and I can respect that. But I'm just saying, pragmatically speaking, that's my perspective on it. And I think it's a failure of the Anglosphere countries and of the Dutch in particular that these people were not offered just full citizenship to whatever countries in the 90s when this entire project fell apart. But make no mistake, the broader implications of what's happening in South Africa is that they are trying to once again uh, insert themselves into a BRICS nation. In that the Afrikaners, once again, I am fully sympathetic to their struggle. I'm fully sympathetic to what they have to go through at the hands of their own government, are at risk of being turned into pawns of the American empire, who is known for using and throwing away their proxies.
Uh, I don't know what I could add to that. I think that's very concise, very well put. Um, I will say the only thing I can add, I think I don't know if Trump actually has a plan, or what might be happening is he might be switching plans. Right now, I'll give him credit. Okay, I hesitate to say credit. I'm beginning to reconsider, his whole Gaza Largo thing. No, because of course it's ridiculous, right? But did he intentionally say something so ridiculous, right? In order to get the ball rolling, right? China, for instance, endorsed Egypt's idea for reconstructing and settling the Gaza
And
situation,
even the Gulf
which would not
states.
mean the expulsion of Palestinians from Gaza. Now, there is a shelf life to this. Eventually, something will have to happen there. But you could make the argument that Trump decided to sound like intentionally or otherwise, he decided to sound like an idiot and offend a lot of people in order to get the ball rolling. I mean, it's very generous. I can understand some people who would say, no, he's an idiot and he's done stuff like this before, and it wasn't some ploy. It's not Trumpian 4D chess, et cetera, et cetera.
Everything is
But
Trumpian 40 chess, I'll have you know.
oh, I know, right? Um, but it is something to think about, right? Like, so I have that on my mind. The other thing is, of course, just to return very briefly back to the hysterics that are coming out of Europe. Um, I mean, there was a woman on German television who was at one of these summits and said, um, Europe has to arm itself against America and Russia. Yeah, 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 yeah. I mean, now I don't know if you're someone like Brian Berletic, like you just laugh this stuff off, right? It's ridiculous. Um, however, and then you have like I have to show you this. This is if you could please share it. Like I don't know. I don't want to over inflate the importance of The Economist, but The Economist is still a regime publication, and they will often support or indicate what the next thing is.
I forgot about this. I had erased this from my mind. But but you're right. The Economist is one of those ones that just comes out and tells you like it is. So
I like what
let me get let me get this. I hate this.
it's
Thank you. It's
it's ludicrous, right? Like are we supposed to think it's ludicrous and just
I love.
secretly laugh it off, but publicly say yes, he's doing the right thing? Like I love what some people said about this. This cover is inspired by Starmer raising the British quote unquote defense spending from 2.5 of GDP by 2027. Like this underlines just how ridiculous all this is. Like these people are talking about moving a half a percentage point over 2 years,
And
or a
I
full
love
percentage point, right? Like
I
there's something not serious about this.
no none of it's serious. None of it is ever serious. And I love the stories attached to this. The danger signals for Trumponomics. Time to lift serious sanctions. What a poorly timed article. Time to lift serious sanctions. Germany rearms, and my favorite, R.I.P. foreign aid. Oh yeah, but it is this actually does touch on something of another point I wanted to make, and yeah, like the entire proposal is ridiculous. Like where they're yeah, they're incrementally moving towards what is just a pittance in defense spending, and this reminds me of how the Europeans this week were outraged. The European media was outraged about Vance's alleged disrespect of our NATO allies, where because once again his comments were is some random country with 20,000 troops going to play peacekeeper, and the British immediately took that to be a slight at them, the British media, and they went just off the rails with it.
Look what Wyatt Reed wrote. This makes Starmer look very tough, not at all like a child in his dad's suit. Oh my
uh,
God. That's brutal. And then someone had this as a meme. The British are this is the next tranche of British support for the recruitment process in Ukraine.
oh no. Hold on, let me. Never let it be
Oh, that's
said that this does not double as a comedy show. Okay, and that's what I think we excel at here.
Yeah.
You can't get this kind of coverage anywhere else, can you?
It's just ridiculous.
Um, and while we're on this point, there was something I saw about a seething Czech I wanted to bring up.
Mm.
Who was very incensed about Vance's comments. And this is, and I'm not going to name where it came from because I don't want any potential, like, oh, you incited harassment, blah, blah, blah. But this is just some random check, okay? So, quote, some random country, 11,500 Czech soldiers went to Afghanistan. 14 paid the ultimate price. Many more heavily wounded. Czech Special Operation Force deployed as soon as 2002, and Czechs were there until the very end. Our special operations forces worked with U.S. SOF to our soldiers provide information to U.S. generals. Our infantry regulars went to patrols with U.S. infantrymen. Czech military police from the TF Kamba evacuated critical personnel in Kabul as the airport was already surrounded. Random country. Yeah, you just stated the purpose of why countries like you are in NATO without realizing it. You are there to be the meat shield for the next
Yeah.
imperial project. This is not about
Yes.
protecting you. This is not about saving you from Russian invasion. This is about putting you in the meat grinder if war with Russia ever breaks out. And you outright say it, but you're still too thick-headed to realize that's what you just said.
The main disconnect is this. Now, I said this on the show when, by the way, I don't know if people know, you and I recorded with Geo last Friday, and you can go to Geo's Substack. I think he has part of the video. We streamed it live on Geo's channel.
Yeah, he created a like a 15-minute teaser, and then if you want to give him your money, as you should, you can watch the full thing.
Yeah. Yeah, so and I also did a show. I want to give a shout out to World War Now. I did a show with Conrad and Isaac, mostly talking about all the major geopolitical points that are usually covered on this show, but also in addition, an emphasis on Syria in the Middle East. And again, there's not a show like World War Now, which includes Orthodox prophecy, very concise, to the point presentation of the information, great analysis by Conrad and Dimitri in breaking things down, and just an uncanny ability to predict things. Anyway, so I
Def-
follow Geo, follow World War Now, support them because they're excellent. And as I said, some of the young guys in my church actually know the guys from World War Now. They literally told me. It's like, think, oh, Uber Boyo, I know who that is. Do you know World War Now? I'm going like, oh my God. maybe, maybe maybe those headlines I'm reading about in the New York Times are real. What the heck?
But
Why are you asking me?
celebrity status, and they don't even know it.
So this is in the Financial Times. Another insane headline from kooky Europe. But just for me to get back to the here's the basic disconnect, and I said this on the last show, that when America switches the game, Europe has a very difficult time adapting, right? But if we understand power theory, right, America is the hegemon, Europe is the vassal. The vassal is one, never allowed to have a military bigger than the hegemon. Two, the vassal has to think that he's being protected instead of being a spearhead against an enemy of the hegemon. Okay, that's how it works. And this is why they feel abandoned, because all this time they thought, well, we're not a spearhead. We're just we're defending ourselves by going forward, right, closer and closer to Russia. And they gave themselves all kinds of what seemed reasonable excuses
We're not a
that,
spearhead.
well,
We're
it's
just a
just a freedom of
spearhead.
choice. It's just a freedom of choice, bro. They can all join if they want, bro.
Yeah, NATO's a defensive alliance. We've never launched an offensive operation. That never happened. Yugoslavia never happened. Libya never happened. And
but a lot of this is, of course, they're getting ready for the midterms.
oh
The
yeah,
Europeans want Trump to lose the midterms, and they are in this. This is why Zelensky does not pay attention to Trump. This is why he's obstinate. He can cross his arms in the Oval Office, but he also is very defiant. His face makes very dismissive gestures, with his eyes. Like he acts like he's listening to a petulant child. And I know that'll make a lot of people happy if who hate Trump. I get it. But he is not behaving like the puppet he is. And that's because he firmly believes that one way or another, I mean, I'm not saying he's right. In fact, it'll probably play out that he's very wrong. But he believes the power structure is somewhere else, and it's not with Trump. And don't doubt that in a year the political landscape in America won't be very different than it is now. These people are biding their time. Um, they're not just going along with it. They have to, even if they are going along with Trump's idea of pivoting to China even more than they are, right? Because now we've already established after 2024 that the Democrats are just as much of a Zionist party as the Republicans. They still want him out, right? It's just to what extent will they go to do that?
yeah, absolutely right. They're not gonna relent on the issue, considering the fact that even if Trump does bend the knee and kiss the ring, or kiss the knee and bend the ring, as I prefer to say, he is still too defiant in rhetoric. He is still too much of a personality. He's still too much of a representative of everything they hate, and he's also a too much of a potential liability, because as we saw with Ukraine, even if everything does return to status quo, the Ukrainians had lost valuable time that they did not have to lose, and that this has delayed and stymied the war effort in a critical time where they cannot be delayed or stymied, or else the defeat is going to be even worse. So, somebody like Trump is, let me put it this way, while in many cases he does end up cooperating, he is still viewed as too unreliable by the establishment. He is
and
still
and too unpredictable.
too
Yeah,
unreliable, too unpredictable, too much of an independent actor, uh, as far as they would say, for his own good. And I would agree with that assessment. I know that Trump has all the interests pulling in different directions, as we all know, as we've gone over
yeah.
many times. But like I said, a lot of it comes down to rhetoric. A lot of it comes down to presentation. And it comes down to the fact that, oh, he might have a shouting match with Zelensky in the Oval Office one day, despite the fact that, yeah, he might continue on business as usual. But that, while he might continue on in policy and agenda, those kind of antics are not good for business. So therefore, he is too much of a liability, and they're willing to tolerate him. Particularly, I think we've discussed this many times, but the establishment made their peace with him on the Israel issue that he's the guy who's going to back Israel. He's the guy who's going to get Gaza Largo. And to touch on your point with that, um, I don't think it was necessarily Trumpian 4D chess. I do think it just goes back to the fact that he has so many different interests pulling him so many different directions where that was just kind of a bone he was trying to throw to it where maybe he was never going to take the policy seriously, but something he had. And like I said, I don't think that Trump is secretly plotting to take down Israel and that this is all the long game. But but I do think it's a bone he had to throw to them just to get them to shut up about the issue. Look, I'm a great real estate guy, and that's how we're going to solve this issue. And then the Arab states actually gave him something of an out where he can kick the can down the road, just a
Yeah.
few more months because and I think that's happened with Trump a lot. And my over, not to get too far down this path, but my overall take on him is he's clearly not stupid. He's very successful in his own right. But I think on a lot of political, strategic, and geopolitical matters, he is still profoundly ignorant, even after 4 years plus his current term in office. And that there's some things he just simply does not understand, and that he does in a way, and sometimes it works out, sometimes doesn't, approaches everything like a Manhattan real estate deal. And like I said, that has its ups and downs, but he's no Kissinger. Let's just put it that way. He,
Yeah, no.
yeah, I think there's some things he doesn't understand. And I think there's some things just because of how his mind works, just because of his temperament, that he will never understand. Which, like I said, has its drawbacks and certainly has its benefits as far as people like us are concerned. Uh, but I mean, it's definitely going to be interesting, and he still does. He presents enough of a disruption in the system where I can still somewhat have him in my good grace. So I'll just put it that way. Not entirely. I have plenty of criticism, as you've all heard on this show many times over, and also he's kind of funny.
Yeah, he really can be. He actually has comedic timing.
Impeccable.
I sent you a graphic that demonstrates military hardware by the biggest players, certainly not all.
Where's that at?
Uh, in your telegram.
When did you send it? Because it didn't come. The last thing I have is the
Okay,
Economist article or the Financial Times article. So
how about now?
um, it's still sending. Um, so
Yeah, so I sent you a graphic, and you could see who are the biggest donators, what's being withheld. Um, I mean, I think people shouldn't overplay it, right? Like, for instance, the Russians took out a HIMARS today or yesterday. I think it was yesterday. And uh, but remember, they took out 4 or 5 HIMARS in August and in September, right? When they did have more participation by the Americans. But I think the media is going to play this up, right? And we should also consider that the European Union, especially vis-a-vis Macron, is looking at a way to come out from under the Americans. That is, they are interested in building up their military more so for themselves than Ukraine. Now, they want a foothold in Ukraine for sure, but they also want military deterrence. Uh, it's going to be very difficult because their economies are not good. It will take a long time, but you can look at it that the ultimate goal is for Europe to find a different direction um, than being with the US or being with China or being with anybody else.
yes, the grand European sovereignty. Yes, but you do see this in the rhetoric coming out of both France and Germany, where Merz wants to remilitarize and reindustrialize Germany. With what energy and industrial base? I have to wonder. And you also get, while it may not be publicly, Macron getting a little hot under the collar with that because, as far as he's concerned, the European project is to be a French led one and not a German led one. And he thought when Merkel was riding off into the sunset, it was going to be his moment, that he was going to be the premier politician of Europe. And in many ways, he is. But I do think, in terms of his personal position, in terms of the position of France and its influence over Europe, he does fear something of a displacement in that regard. Where, oh, by the way, the image you tried to send just sent forward at 5 different times, so don't worry, it's coming through. But getting back to my point, where, well, number one, I don't think Germany's plan for reindustrialization, remilitarization is viable in the slightest. Don't get me wrong, but I do think it presents a, I don't want to say wedge between France and Germany because I don't think that the EU is going to break down over this, but it does present once again these squabbling rivalries you get out of the European elite, which, if the Americans do continue to shift focus away from Europe, are only going to intensify. That Europe is only going to break down into more and more, at least political infighting, where uh, the German faction, the French faction, probably some British interplay, assuming that Starmer doesn't put the British back in the EU, which I don't think is going to happen, but you never know. And then just all the other factions. All the while, you have some of these states on the fringes. Think Slovakia, Hungary, possibly Romania. I know that they are having their scandals right now. Some elements in Croatia, as we discussed, Milanovic. Austria is one of those countries that goes back and forth on it, where they do have somewhat of a populist undercurrent. That, and like I said, all while you have a lot of these countries on the periphery start to waver in their loyalty to Brussels or demand an entirely different direction, to the point where probably one of the most significant politicians in Europe, once again, is Orban, the Hungarian prime minister, simply just because he's so outspoken, because he's made himself into so much of a firebrand. And that shouldn't be the case, looking at the structure of Europe. The Hungarian prime minister should be a nobody. And even Fico has made somewhat of a name for himself on the same basis. So, especially as the Americans, like I said, if they really do divert their time, money, and resources elsewhere, if there really is the so-called pivot to Asia or some crisis in the Middle East, Europe is going to become even more politically dysfunctional. That there's not going to be any headway. That they're going to continue to suppress the will of the people. That the wrong parties, as we saw in Romania, are simply just not going to be allowed to win the election. They will nullify election results if they have to. They will form these grotesque Frankenstein coalitions to stop a slightly reformist party from even taking power. And then the ones that do take power, as we saw in Italy, and as we, well, I suppose they're not in power in the UK, but as we see in the UK, they will be compromised. And even Le Pen is
Hmm.
coming out and making bizarre comments. Le Pen has always waffled on Ukraine since the start of the war, so I'm not going to put too much stock into her words. But once again, she's also going back and forth in Ukraine, saying, "Oh, it's so terrible that we have to deal with the situation and that Russia invaded, blah, 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 blah." Whereas you had in 2022, towards the beginning of the war, it's like, we want nothing to do with this. We can't escalate this problem. And it goes where these movements are either suppressed or compromised. And perhaps this is me putting too much stock in political discontent. Perhaps I assume too much of the people in Europe, but I can't imagine what a breaking point would be. I imagine it would have to be combined with probably some sort of significant standard of living. And if they really are brazen enough to implement austerity policies to direct money from social spending to military, that might just do it if sustained for long enough. And
Hmm.
because what I think is going to happen, I think they're going to dabble in it. They're going to realize that this requires a cost cutting from the generous welfare state, which once again, they're completely entitled to have. I have no problems with that when it's functional. But when cuts start to be made there in order to rebuild a war machine for a quote unquote alleged Russian threat, the people are going to be outraged, rightfully so, because there's no real existential threat. They're simply building up arms to get involved in a war that they have no business in, that never even need to happen, and they're going to risk at that point, if they do not change course, actually losing their base power because they are affecting people's bottom lines. And that's when people actually do take to the streets. That's when people actually do engage in political violence and discontent. And if there's anyone savvy enough to take advantage of that situation, that's when you get revolutions. Not necessarily even in the bloody, we're going to take to the streets with our arms, civil war kind of stuff, but even just quote unquote bloodless regime change or so called political regime change, where the establishment just gets swept down the river because they had become so incompetent at governing. And I'm not saying that's
Mhm.
going to happen, I'm not saying that's likely, but I'm saying if the Europeans do take their own proposals seriously, if Mertz does have his way, they do run the risk of that if they push this project too far.
Yeah, and we should talk a little bit about Macron's speech and its tone. It was, you could consider it invective towards Russia and towards Putin, um, and at times implying almost like a nuclear threat to Russia. It wasn't just about creating an umbrella for all of Europe. Of course, they have, like less than 200 nuclear missiles. There's an argument that once you have 1 to 2,000, then uh, you're a player, so to speak,
And also
right?
pitiful range compared to any of the major nuclear powers like the Americans, Russians, or Chinese. Even
Yeah.
even the Israelis probably have longer range missiles, if we're being honest.
Right, right, right. So
Hell, India and Pakistan probably have longer range missiles than France does.
yes, and so you know, uh, he he's trying to take over that sort of, because up until Trump, Europe, pretending to be defensive, was interested in being like a kind of a reluctant spearhead, right? And by overplaying their commitment to supporting Ukraine, for Ukraine to do the dying while they do, the military hardware. And you know, uh, so I think he's trying to maintain that, but under European auspices, which is what makes the whole thing so laughable. I mean, forget even that most of the European public, maybe with the exception of Britain, because Britain, yet again, the British public, based on what I'm hearing from other channels, is kind of okay. Some of them are kind of okay going into Ukraine under some kind of security agreement, security umbrella, right? But remember what Zelensky said: "Oh, they will be on the front lines, right? Like the French and the British and maybe the Germans will be on the front lines." So the way he had this tone while asking for a peace, no, a calm and peaceful Russia, which implies, of course, that there has to be a regime change in Russia, right? Again, we've talked on this show for many years that basically the Democrats and the Eurocrats are interested in destroying Russia first and then going for China. That they think it's a fool's errand to even go after China while not taking care of Russia. And we've accepted that that's probably a better strategy, because Trump is not going to be able to pry Russia from China now. And but of course, one of the things we don't have that we do have now, especially after 2024, is the idea that Iran is the weak link. And we've talked to death about the north-south corridor between Russia and Iran vis-a-vis the Caspian Sea, and how that delivers supplies eventually that go to India, and from India to China, et cetera, and other routes. That's not the only route, right? So um, Macron has always wanted a leadership position, as he pointed out very well. Kind of like a representative of Europe. He wants to be not just France, but Europe. I mean, he's a goof in many ways, but he's always had very high aspirations. So,
Yeah, and I think we've probably exhausted anything we could say about the
mhm.
European situation beyond. I just need to bring up Poland and Donald Tusk's plan to train every military aged man. And people are speculating that Poland is gearing up for war. Tusk has said Poland has to be ready for war. Blah 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 blah. And
Mm,
now I don't think they're preparing to go into Ukraine. I think
no.
they've made that clear. But I do think there is some level of precaution or maybe delusion, depending on which way you want to look at it, that they believe the war is going to spread to their frontiers. Or maybe we're going to get the secret base third option where Poland's going to retake Galicia. But no,
Oh God.
no, it's never going to happen. Honestly, it might be for the best. Just let it happen. Just let NATO and Poland deal with the fallout of that, while Russia is the rest of Ukraine, and maybe Hungary and Romania can peel off Transcarpathian and Bukovina respectively. But I'm not holding out hope for that option. But yes, Tusk also floated the idea of Poland obtaining nuclear weapons. I mean, I'm not even going to touch on Zelensky's comment because Zelensky has said that about half a dozen times, and it's just as schizophrenic every time he says it. But I do take the polls slightly more seriously when they talk about nuclear armament because they can't rely on, say, the Americans or even the Western Europeans to defend them because Poland has just been beaten down so many times, and that they're not gonna get beaten down again. Poland is standing up for itself this time, and um, on a minor note, I suppose the Commonwealth is back together because both Poland and Lithuania withdrew from the treaty that banned cluster munitions and cluster mines. So, which, mind you, neither Russia and Ukraine were in that treaty, and I don't even think the Americans were at that point. So the serious war-ready countries are not in that treaty. So I think that is an
Mhm.
indication if you want to read into it. But I like how Lithuania had to tag along on that one. That's how you know it's serious
Yeah, yeah.
when the least deranged Baltic state starts doing deranged things. That's how you know it's getting bad. And I would maintain that. I think compared to Estonia and Latvia, Lithuania looks sane. Um,
No, they've been awfully quiet.
yeah,
Is Estonia is the most nuts.
I have a certain, I don't know if respect is the word. Maybe it is. I have a certain respect for Lithuania that I don't have for the other two Baltic states. I don't know what it is. It's just that I don't know the Latvians. I don't know. Their entire identity is like our great grandfathers were in the Cheka, our grandfathers were in the SS, and we're in the European Union. that's that's their whole thing. And then the Estonians are just unhinged. You get Kaya Kallas, and that's just the entire nation of Estonia. Yeah, we were all Soviet officials until like 30 years ago, and now we're going to act like the Soviet Union was the worst thing to ever happen to our country. that's
Yeah,
that's
yeah, yeah,
that's
yeah.
what it is. Whereas the Lithuanian, maybe it's from the benefit that they were once a significant power. They once had an influence on the European stage, and I do think that does things to a country. And I think in the same way Poland also. And I know that they were kind of in on that together. But I do think it gives them even a certain perspective, even if it has been centuries since then, that other countries don't have, which makes them. I'm not going to say ground in reality, but slightly more ground in reality than say the Lithuanian, not the Lithuanians, because I'm praising them right now, the Latvians or the Estonians or like even the Ukrainians at that point. But maybe I'm reading too much into that.
Hmm.
But yeah, like I said, I can't bring myself because like okay, I not to harp on the subject too much. I can't stand Estonia. I cannot stand Latvia. I can appreciate Lithuania despite my problems. That Poland, I actually like as a nation, despite the fact that I think it's going in a very stupid direction. That's the way I would put it. Um,
Right.
but the, to get beyond my opinion of Poland and the Baltic states, I suppose where this takes us now, the next big item this week is Syrian democracy, as the
Yes.
episode is titled, and um, Al Jilani. I'm sorry, Al Shara. He put on the suit and changed his name, so he's a legitimate leader now. Despite the fact that he's going to blur out the photos of Annalena Baerbock for his official press releases.
Oh
Uh,
my God.
Even after making her wear the hijab. But if anyone deserves it, who else would it be except Annalena? I can't think of anyone
Yes.
else. But maybe Kaya Kallas, perhaps, or Ursula. I don't know. But speaking of Ursula, the European Commission decided to put a very intelligent statement condemning pro-Assadists for the outbreak of
Oh, this is
violence in Syria.
yeah, let's backtrack a little
Yeah,
bit
yes.
because
Let's establish some context. But because I brought up,
yeah, let's
oh,
put in some context because yes, there were some people in the extreme west side of Syria along the Mediterranean shore, which is predominantly overwhelmingly Alawite, who had endured essentially 3.5 months of killings. Okay, they never stopped. Like when I say I have seen like a well filled with like women who had been killed and thrown in, I'm not lying to you. You can see these videos, right? They literally kill like old men on the streets. And so what happened was they claimed the force is about 4,000 strong. Two separate convoys of HTS. Now, some are arguing now after the bloodbath, which has resulted the Times of Israel said 350 dead, right? Uh, Europeans are saying dozens of dead, but I'm guessing the Israelis have better knowledge of this. And then the Syrian Observatory is saying over 700 dead. Okay, and they're not all Alawites; they include Christians as well. In fact, the father of one of the priests for the Church of the Annunciation was also killed. Is an elderly man. I think he's even like a few years older than my dad.
and mind you, Jelani's entire press strategy was we're tolerant, we're diverse. The DEI for HTS was his entire thing. Where we're going to actually invite the uh, one of the it was one of the Christian bishops. I can't remember from which church to actually be mayor of Aleppo. Uh, all the
Yeah.
while, we're going to slaughter his flock in the streets, and
Yes.
it's
So they're trying to make it look like a peace was restored in Syria, right? And then for no reason at all, Alawites rebelled. Now, this is day two, and they're still fighting. Estimates are between 4 to 7,000 Alawites and Christians are now in the Latakia base, the Russian base in Latakia, right? And it is their only safe haven. I have seen videos where in a village there are over 2 dozen corpses of men. I've seen these animals in a pickup truck literally kill an old man. I've seen them making three individuals who you can tell based on their physique and their age are not part of the uprising and are forced to crawl on their hands and knees and are shot. I've seen teenagers killed. I've seen a home where four children, I would say between the ages of 2 and 10, have been killed. That's what these animals are doing. And um, Trump is very quiet about this. And Trump bears responsibility for this, right? HTS could have been wiped out in 2019 if he did not intervene. Getting rid of like one of five or six different al Baghdadis is bullshit. right? He continued the sanctions that Obama started. He increased them. The robbery still went on. Biden continued the same path. And, he's president, is doing nothing. He's doing dick all. And now you have people saying Russia dropped the ball in Syria. It's like, are you serious? Are you serious? Like, is now involved in like the largest land war in Europe in 80 years, right? And you want them to be able to do this as well, right? Where are you? You literally have more military there, more persuasion, greater economic power to stop this, and you can't even talk about it, right? Don't let them off the hook. Don't give me this Turkey, Qatar, blah blah blah. America's the ringleader there. Okay, America started, enabled this from the beginning with intelligence and like literally killing Wagner and Russian soldiers who were fighting against ISIS. Like
And mind you, the
d-
Russians, to the very end of the Assad regime, were still bombing HTS.
they were, they were, they as they were celebrating in their cities, the Russians were bombing them, even after Syrian forces, those who could, managed to escape. Okay, so don't give me I hate this kind of bullshit. Like it's on the Russians. No, this war wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for the Americans. They sponsored this. And the killings that we're seeing now are exactly like the way it started in 2011. Sunnis were doing this in 2011. Okay. That's how it started. Um,
It's gotten so bad where Jelani's HTS guys, they're killing other Sunnis for being insufficiently Sunni.
that's right.
It all comes back around. This is what it looks like if you were to give Al Qaeda or ISIS control of the country, because that's what happened. It just wanton slaughter. And even with some of the cases where you'll remember that with, say, the Yazidis in Iraq in particular, where they slaughtered the men, took the women, it's not even that. They're just killing everyone. There's no prisoners, no hostages, no slaves. It's just wholesale slaughter. It's genocide. Like, there's no other word. It is genocide of the Alawites, of the Shia, of the Christians, and even, like I said, of a significant amount of the Sunnis. And then you're probably also getting into different tribal rivalries within Syria where people are being slaughtered on that basis. All the while, Israeli tanks are 20 kilometers from Damascus. Jolani, who was supposed to be the real fighter against the Zionists, unlike that puppet Assad, who was just playing song and dance and was a secret Israeli puppet the whole time. Unlike him, Jolani is fighting the Zionists by wholesale slaughter in Latakia, because that's what's happening right now.
Yeah, yeah.
And this entire time, let's what's left of Syrian air defenses, what's left of any Syrian military assets get eviscerated by the Israelis within less than 24 hours of Assad's fall. And they're dedicating what military resources they have left, which seems to be quite a lot. It seems like if they wanted to, they could be putting up a fight in Daraa, in southern Syria, where the Israelis are encroaching on their territory. The man who's supposed to be the president who's going to restore Syria's freedom, prosperity, and sovereignty. There doesn't seem to
Hmm.
be much effort there, but there seems to be plenty of time, manpower, and resources to commit wholesale slaughter against his own people.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Like this
And
is what.
don't also we shouldn't also forget that Trump also assassinated Soleimani,
Yes, and that
right?
was disastrous. The
So
Syrian war effort.
he has blood on his hands, and he should say something here, right? But he's shying away from it, just like the Europeans. And in fact, the European Union put out a statement, like you said earlier. Um, so I'm sorry if I'm repeating you, but essentially blaming the Assad regime. It's like the killing never stopped. I am glued to Telegram and sometimes Twitter. Of course, I can't interact on Twitter, and Musk isn't going to unban me. Um, but so I'm very well aware of what they've been doing nonstop, right? What do you expect them to do? Now, I think part of the anger of HTS, and of course now they're saying that these were rogue elements and that they're going to send forces. and they will stop the reprisals, right? But let's look at what actually happened on the ground. The Alawites did not kill civilians. They only killed soldiers, and they took prisoners. This is not something you can say for HTS. Okay. Like I have seen like a mound of men on their knees, like lying down on their stomachs, over 2 dozen before they're all shot up. It's the same ISIS people that you saw 11 years ago. Okay. It's not different. And
They
one of them
changed
takes a
flags, they
sledgehammer
changed
to,
names. It's all the
yeah,
same people doing the same things.
it's the same people, right? It's the same people. Now there is an HTS fighter who actually made a video, and if I were him, I would hide. Um, he goes by the name of Muhammad Abu Obaida. He wrote, "Does our religion command us to kill innocent civilians in their homes? Did the Prophet permit us to drag them from their homes and kill them in cold blood?" Because now there's plenty of video evidence. And then there is this Sunni woman, an absolute witch, who is saying, you know what? Why are you filming this? She's not saying stop. She's saying you shouldn't film it. You should just throw them into the sea. Like, this is the brain power of someone with an IQ of 75, thinking like, oh, if you just throw them in the sea, no one will find out, right? It's ludicrous. These people are absolute savages. And a lot of countries that don't think they're savages empowered them. So the main thing that they're upset about, of course, is because the Alawites captured some of their commanders. What's more is they actually have. Let me see if I can find them. I have their names. They actually killed HTS transitional government official in charge of the government fruit and vegetable sector. Like, I don't know. He was probably there in the Latakia area. He has been killed, and the commander of the HT forces in Kurin. Um, uh, his name is uh, Haitam Ga- Ghanimi. I'm sorry, it's very difficult to pronounce these names. So, um, and protests have been going on for quite some time by Alawites, by Druze, by Christians, saying you have to stop this. That has been going on ever since Syria fell. Okay, and but what's more, in Syria, in Turkey, Syrian Alawites have also started public demonstrations and um, just with speakers addressing a public in the streets about what's happening there, right? Of course, Erdogan will do nothing. Israel will do nothing. In fact, Israel is apparently tomorrow going to go after more territory. Now, Jelani, for the first time this week, complained to the UN and the Arab League about all the territory that Israel is going to take. It's like, well, my dude, did you not figure this out, right? Did you not figure out that you would lose territory? Like, you're a loser. You actually, Syria became smaller under you, right?
And
Now,
you
what
worked with
might
Israel
happen
to make it
actually,
happen for
yes,
13
yes,
years.
for 13 years, Israel has bombed Syria. So Israel is definitely one of those contributors. And of course, here's Israel, according to Netanyahu, even admitted to treating some of these people
Yes,
who were wounded in the conflict with the Assad
and
government.
for years this was used as proof of Israel's moral superiority that they
Oh yeah,
gave
yeah.
such kind medical treatment to terrorists before funneling them back into Syria.
Mm.
Yeah, yes, as if it was just mercy upon the enemy that we always expect from Israel, and that they were allowed to go on about their lives and not go on to fight in what at that time was one of the most pitched conflicts in the world. And we see we see this happen time and time and time again. And for all those people, I don't think there's anyone listening, but for all those people who want to talk about Israel being a bulwark against radical Islam, they're one of its biggest sponsors. Let's not kid ourselves.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Absolutely, absolutely. There's more than one country involved. I'm just saying the main backer was America.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And we all know those orders came from Tel Aviv. They get laundered and then through Turkey and Qatar, et cetera, et cetera. As I don't think we need to explain this network. We've done it a million times. Other people have done it a million times. If you're listening to the show, you're probably familiar.
Yeah.
But as you were saying, on the point of Jelani's wholesale slaughter, and then
Yes.
he finally kvetches the UN that Israel, they stabbed us in the back. Who would have thought?
Pff. Like if only you were as determined against the Israelis as you are against the Alawites. You know, the Palestinians might have their own state. Of course, they'll all say this. Oh, we're just too weak. We're too weak. I mean, you have a lot of energy. You have a lot of energy to do this. I mean, anyways,
Well, as the old joke
I
goes,
get it. Their funding is coming from the very same countries that support Israel. So whatever.
as the old joke goes, if they just told all these Salafists that Israel was full of Shia Muslims, the war would have been over in 2 days.
Yeah, yeah.
It yeah, that's how upside down these people's priorities are. The great liberators of the Palestinian cause, and then of course, uh, I said this when Assad fell from power, and I'll say it again. All these morons, both among Western leftists and among people within the Middle East, who purport themselves as the greatest champions of the Palestinian cause, who simultaneously cheer on the downfall of Assad and call for revolution in Iran. And I have to want, how serious are you about this? What under? Well, no, they don't understand the situation. It's just a hobby horse to many of them, and it's just it's so ridiculous that uh, the only way to undermine Israel is to side with it in every conflict, and that's that's really what it comes down to. That's what these people believe, and that's what they will continue to believe. And as far as that's concerned, the Palestinian cause will simply not get off the ground unless Israel pushes its luck so far that it loses the confidence of I don't know, the Arab states that it has all these backdoor agreements in, but I think that would take a lot. Or if American power wanes to the point where Israel looks vulnerable, then they might take their chances at it. But as we've seen, they're more eager to fight, kill, and slaughter each other than any of the Zionist occupiers. And that's we see this time and time again. And perhaps that's the greatest American geopolitical success in the Middle East is the fact that none of them can form a united front, and their greatest wars are against each other. But on that note, among the news of just these slaughters in Latakia, you had elements of the former 4th Armored Division declare the Syrian Military Council for Freedom. And let me look up the general's name here, because he was one of the leaders of the 4th Division during the, I suppose, what you could call the first phase of the Syrian Civil War. And that is Gaith Suleiman Dalla, who was a former commander, has announced the beginning of operation against HTS terrorists with the aims of toppling the regime, in his own statement's words. And while it's not incumbent upon the Iranians, and certainly not the Russians, both who have far more pressing concerns at the moment, if they are able to establish some sort of existing state, some sort of breakaway state, in let's just say Latakia or some other part of Syria, then the question of having support for their cause might hold some weight. And it may be the case if this is serious, if this isn't just an uprising that is brutally suppressed, which given how unstable Syria is, I could very easily see this escalating into another phase of civil war. If remnants of the 4th Division, especially under its leadership, are able to establish some sort of foothold in Latakia, especially along the coasts, then you might be talking about something. Maybe they won't overthrow Jelani, maybe they won't overthrow HTS, but it could be a Kurdistan situation where they run a de facto independent state with foreign backing in Syria. And that might be the best outcome for the Alawites, for the Christians, for the Sunnis who aren't so radical that they want to participate in these sort of actions. Some of the more, I guess you could say, moderate Sunnis and the Shias, of course. And but once again, it is incumbent on the forces on the ground to actually establish control of this area before they can go begging for foreign support. Because at this point, the Russians, the Iranians, no other backers have any reason to embark on this project. There's simply too many other concerns. And well, once again, I do have full sympathy for the people who have to uh, bear this burden, who are being slaughtered in the streets right now. Uh, Realistically, the only way this ends is if they are able to establish their foothold against the regime, and then we can talk. Then the presence of Russian forces there, like they had under Assad, becomes much more viable with their air base, with their ports there, especially seeing as they are not vital, but very convenient in terms of Russian operations in Libya and Africa. They are a good stopping and refueling point for a lot of the Russian supplies and manpower that would move through that region. Then we could talk about this, especially depending on how the war in Ukraine goes. If Ukraine does continue to crumble, if that does free up more Russian resources, we could very easily see uh, this sort of situation go. And I don't want to speculate too far in the future because we're probably talking on a timeline of months, if not years, where this happens. Because it could very well, and I think probably the best example we have of this is Libya, where Libya still is divided by two governments, where Haftar still does have very strong support from the Russians and actually a variety of other states like Egypt. I think even the Iranians have some contact with him. But we could get a situation where Syria is, yes, divided, but there is that foothold of, let's be honest, civilization in some parts of the country.
Yeah. Um, this is kind of like what has to happen. Um, they're not going to like it. I suppose the Sunnis will be very upset because of course, they're the majority. They're going to want all the territory, et cetera, et cetera. But I mean, they've kind of proven that I'm sorry, but they're subhuman. They're like the way they treat other people. I mean, they're renowned for it. Um, they exhibit the kind of cruelty that I've only seen from the Israelis.
They are one and the same.
And some of the I'll leave it at that. I'll leave it at that.
Uh, the Salafists and the Zionists, down to pretty much every point of their ideology, they are mirror image of each other. One is just Jewish, the other is Muslim. It's that
Yeah.
simple. Uh, they're probably the worst. The worst. These are probably some of the biggest scum on earth. And this is what we have to deal with. And like I said, the reason I use Salafists is because I don't want to indict all Sunnis, even though a troubling number of them in Syria go along with this. But I do think that if by some stretch of the imagination this carve out is able to be established, then we can talk. Even with some of the more, let's just say, mainstream, non Salafist elements of the Sunnis who aren't susceptible to this kind of radicalization, is the ones who enjoy maybe the lifestyle that was under Assad, the ones who, uh, like I said, aren't willing to turn the entirety of Syria into Idlib. Then we might have
Yeah.
some room to talk. But until then, the situation will continue on, and the slaughter will continue, and uh, because it's not going to
They're
stop,
saying the real estimates are around 2,400,
I
but they can safely say at least 745 in a day.
I would imagine it's probably more than that, and
Yeah.
especially with these situations, they tend to underestimate. But as it stands now, because Jolani's forces are not going to stop, I just hope the people there can form a united front to defend themselves. And if that necessitates some sort of secessionist movement, some sort of de facto state within a state, then that might even be the case. And they might even have to ink a deal with the devil, so to speak, and have some cooperation with the Kurds, who also worked to overthrow Assad. Let's not forget about their role in this. They can talk about their safe little carve out, the SDF little carve out of Syria. But the reason the rest of Syria is controlled by Al Qaeda and ISIS is because when you had every opportunity to cooperate with the Damascus government, you snubbed them. And now you're getting pressed on both sides from Al Qaeda and ISIS and Turkey. And I have a hard time feeling sympathy with the Kurds because, in many ways, they dug their own graves. It is just that simple. Now, that being said, I do not want to see this kind of wholesale slaughter of anyone of any ethnic and religious background. I think it is subhuman, as you put it. But if the Kurds have painted themselves in this corner, and their people, if this situation does continue to inflame, are going to pay for it. And to address the last question that's come up in regards to this, the question of will the Israelis cast their lots with the Alawites? I know that's been floated. We actually talked about this on Geo Show. It was brought up by somebody in the chat there. All because that show is paywalled. I'll repeat what I said there. Simply no. The Israelis will never forgive the Alawites for having Assad in power, who of course aligned himself with the Iranians. It's it's unforgivable as far as the Israelis concerned. They don't think they can ever trust the Alawites, even though some lobbying efforts might see that as the only pragmatic option. The Israelis will never go along with it, and if they do, we've seen the history of how Israel treats their Middle Eastern allies. You
Mhm.
want the best example of that? Look at the Lebanese Civil War. Look at the Maronites. All the support they got from Israel came with a subsequent stab in the back. And I hope that any sort of anti-Jolani resistance in Syria can understand that, number one, the Israelis got into the situation. Number two, any deal with them is going to be your undoing. And while it might seem tempting, the price you will have to pay for it is is defeat. It's just that simple.
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
Well, look, Jolani was their guy for, as we said, 13, 14 years, and now Israeli forces are within 20 kilometers of Damascus. And I don't think you need any other argument beyond that.
Yes. Yes.
But unless you had any further stories on Syria or anything else, I think that's all I had for this week because news out of East Asia is uneventful. Unless you want to talk about Trump's
I,
ongoing
I,
North American antics.
we could do that. I do have, speaking of antics and just generally funny stuff, this is from JD Vance. I'm not like, I hope people know, like, when I bring these guys up, like, I can separate them doing something funny, right, with and not like pretend I like them.
Yeah, like
Okay.
like any praise or finding humor in what they say must be, and I think our audience knows this, but I will say to clarify for both you and I, is not an indication of blind support or even support at all in some cases.
Yeah, absolutely. But I have to read this because this is hilarious. Today, while walking my 3-year-old daughter, a group of Slava Ukraini protesters followed us around and shouted at my daughter, grew increasingly anxious and scared her. I decided to speak with the protesters in hopes that I could trade a few minutes of conversation for them, leaving my toddler alone. Nearly all of them agreed. It was almost it was a mostly respectful conversation, but if you're chasing a 3-year-old as part of a political protest, you're a shit person.
I mean, that's the Ukraine crowd, as deranged as ever.
Pro Ukraines are targeting VP's 33-year-old daughter. I
Yeah,
I mean that's is kind of how it happened.
uh, making Bandera
But I
proud,
thought
I
that was
guess.
hilarious. What's that?
I said making Bandera proud, I guess.
No kidding.
Uh, yeah. I mean, I because I broached the subject, I think we talked about. I can't remember whether we talked about this on air or not. Like, of all the controversial World War II leaders, there's literally nothing admirable about him, and you can say that about some of the other bigger figures, as controversial as it might be. And like, well, not even like, it might not even necessitate praise. Yeah, you can say like, for example, the the big man with the tiny mustache as compared to the big man with the big mustache. You know which ones I'm referring to,
Yeah.
was a competent leader who came close to accomplishing his goals. Bandera, like, and even compared to like some of like the other minor leaders in Europe, like say like Tiso in Slovakia or um, Horthy in Hungary or Antonescu in Romania, Bandera did not even come close to it. Bandera's the only thing he accomplished was wanton slaughter. Hey, speaking of slaughter in Syria, that's what he did in Galicia. That's what he did to Poles. That's what he did to Russians. That's what he did to Jews. That's what he did to anyone who wasn't a deranged Ukrainian nationalist, pretty much. And this is this is the guy who is the standard bearer of Ukrainian nationalism. What a cut up, what a stand up guy. But to return to the thing about Vance, like, yeah, that's are we shocked? This,
Yeah, yeah, we're
no,
not. We're
no,
not.
no. Nothing but the finest. Slava Ukraini. Hello, Biden. It's Zelensky. I love that clip. I've sent that to you a million. You know the one I'm talking about.
Yes, I know.
We need 5 billion rockets to bomb Donbass children. Slava
Yeah.
Ukraini. It's
Yeah, yeah,
it,
yeah. I mean,
it's yeah. That's the entire Ukrainian effort. While we're on the topic again.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like that quote from the Chinese philosopher that I read earlier, right? There's only one country that can enable like I'm sorry, but goofball nations like that, like who presume they're bigger and better than they really are. And I mean, with America at your back, you're liable to believe it, right?
Oh yeah, yeah. And also one last thing I'll mention about the Middle East, just before we get into some North American antics to close up the show, is that the Houthis re-announced their blockade of the Red Sea, and that they have that back in
Mm.
full force. So it looks like, in light of the recent tensions with Israel, the failure to really achieve a ceasefire, and possibly Trump's Gaza Largo comments, that it looks like blockade of the Red Sea is back in effect. But with all that being said, North America and Trump has continued on with the tariff war. Now, I think this is all worth mentioning, the fact that he had a State of the Union speech. Well, not officially. He had an address to Congress on Tuesday night. And it was pretty standard fare. Uh, he actually avoided talking about most foreign policy issues except Ukraine. He said we're trying to make a deal there. But a lot of it was red meat to the base, talking about reindustrialization and pro-business policy. Played some culture war stuff, so there was that. And then he also talked about tariffs and going forward with that, and America First policy, so on and so forth. But one thing he said is that he is implementing these tariffs, but delaying them until April 2nd in order to enter into negotiations. He made sure that, to clarify, he didn't do it on the first because he didn't want any April Fool's jokes to be assumed.
What a guy.
Yeah, what a guy. And this, of course, after he got berated by Mr. Pimpkane in Congress. And they ejected him. That was entertaining. But like the speech was so standard fare, I debated even bringing it up, and just because we have
Mm.
some time left at the end of the show, I'm going
Yeah,
to
yeah, we
touch on
should.
a
We
little.
should. You're no, you're right. You're
Yeah.
right. Oh, I got it. I'm gonna send you. I'm gonna send you my funniest Trump moments of. You talk. You go ahead.
But yeah, so the pimp came, berated him. He got thrown out. Just typical politicking. Representative Al Green, for those who are curious, they want to listen to the clip or find the clip, because it was like less than 5 minutes in the speech that happened. But like I said, it was, like I said, standard fare. It wasn't as bad as some of his first term ones, like in the 2019 State of the Union, where he announced the homosexuality in Botswana program. If you all remember that, that's when I really started
he,
like to lose
he
hope and
he
think.
did mention the transgender. What was it? The transgender rodent experiments.
Oh yeah, yeah. He went through a list. Yeah, that was entertaining. He went through a list of all like the government waste that Doge had cut. Um, where yeah, one of them had to do with transgender rodents, and it was just it felt like, honestly, it felt like Rand Paul going on an autistic rant about government spending, which is entertaining in its own right. But in all seriousness, to get down to the actual meat and potatoes of Trump policy, it looks like the Mexicans, funny enough, called his bluff, and that the Americans and the Mexicans are engaged in actual real trade negotiations with Claudia Scheinbaum. How a woman like that got elected president of Mexico with a name like that, I have no idea, but this is the reality we live in. But it looks like Canada, your dearest country, uh, cannot even do what Mexico can and call the American bluff and trigger
You
real
made
trade
my prime
negotiation.
minister cry, you
He
bastards.
made Trudeau cry, and now he wants to
What a
renegotiate.
stupid idiot. Oh my god.
And
It's
now he wants to
just
renegotiate the American-Canadian border to make Trudeau cry even more. And you know what? I think it's a good deal for you guys. He's offering to take Toronto off your hands. I don't want it. I think it would be a net negative for America. I don't want to be in the same country as Toronto, but as far as you guys are concerned, it might be to your benefit. I don't know. Who knows? We would get a lot of those H-1Bs Trump was looking for. Uh, so hey, it might be worth it. But I'm getting ahead of myself here, and perhaps you can correct me, being the man up north. But it
the
seems like
man up north.
But it seems like the lack of headway, the reason why Canada cannot do what Mexico is because Trudeau has so little political capital. If he did anything, there would probably be a no confidence vote. To my understanding, is that correct? That Trudeau is just so far in the gutter that he's
He's leaving. We're having an
yeah,
election. Well, the Liberal Party is having an election for their new leader, so he is gone.
yeah, and I know that the federal elections are scheduled for October, but I wouldn't. I'm actually anticipating that they're probably going to be called early, just simply because Trudeau is such a lame duck at this point. He can't do anything.
Yeah. No, he's out. There'll be an election once, basically, once he's
Yeah,
once the Liberals have a new leader. Sorry.
yeah. Once they can convene their party convention and do all their shenanigans. But it does seem like in the time being, while Canada is a bit of an interregnum, Trump is just taking every opportunity he can to poke and prod at them and to try to really see how much they can take and what concessions he can draw from them. To the point, like I said, of even bringing up territorial concessions. Yeah, I want to take the part of Canada where like what half the population lives. Because like he was talking about like I think it was like southern Ontario. I can't remember what parallel it was, but it was just wanting to shift the border north.
Yeah, he's
It's
obviously just trolling. I
yeah,
mean, come
like I said,
on.
I don't expect anything serious from that, and it
I found it. This is it. The moment Trump mentioned $8 million spent on making mice transgender. I'm sending it to you now.
okay, yeah, go ahead. And
I was watching it on the old Glory Club.
yeah, let me get, yeah. I will say just on the State of the Union, Trump was
His face is so incredulous. I love
Trump
it.
Trump was in form. Okay, beyond policy, it was like it's the kind of red meat you want from Trump, and that's why it was a good speech. That's why it was successful. But yeah, just that face right there, where it's just like,
Then he went off about how many people are taking advantage of the welfare system. The social insurance benefits for
yeah,
wait for people between 130 to 139 years of age. I'm gonna send it to you.
yeah, and
Oh, this is I was riveted at these faces that he was making. He was looking at the Democrats like, "Are you for real?" Just look at it.
here I'll get it up. Like
And,
it,
and th-
it's
this is
it's
go
everything
ahead,
you
go
would have
ahead.
it's everything you would have wanted from Trump. He definitely succeeded in as far as that is concerned.
In this one, any one person age three. Okay, so someone literally had social insurance for a person who's 360 years old.
Older
It's,
than the
it's,
United States itself.
he says that's 100. He said that's 100 years older than our country. Just wait. Again, he's looking at the Democrats. Just look at his face. It's a wry smile, ever so faint. Like, you bitches serious?
Oh,
It,
yeah, that was. It's
it,
it's like, thank you, Trump. Very cool. Yeah, so it like insofar as the speech itself is concerned, I don't have many complaints, but like I obviously take it with a heavy dose of reality because of everything we've seen in the past 8 years and beyond, and that you can only expect so much from Trump in terms of concrete policy. But yeah, it was interesting. If any of you for some reason didn't listen to it, which I think pretty much everyone listening to this probably did at least hear the gist of it, I would recommend going to listen to it because I think it was, despite Trump and his Trumpisms, a pretty coherent vision of at least his domestic agenda with some touching on other issues. And I don't want to say it signals change too much because it doesn't, but it does show a new strategy, a new approach is being employed, not only by Trump but by the American regime itself, and they're willing to tolerate Trump actually attempting a new direction. So, for good or for ill, we'll see the totality of that in the next few years, I suppose. Uh, but like I said, I was actually somewhat pleasantly surprised how little foreign policy talk there is, and I know that's probably strange from somebody who does this show. But insofar as the issues that immediately affect me, the issues that, like I said, are going to affect my bottom line, it was mostly domestic policy, which I can praise him on. And like I said, virtually everything. Okay, I should correct myself. Most things he said in the speech, yeah, I could get on board with. But the question is, number one, will they even happen? Number two, if they do, what will it look like? So, like I said, take it with probably a entire shaker of salt at that point. And like I said, I would just recommend you listen to for yourself, draw your own conclusions. But when it comes to his North America policy, I do think it's going to be interesting how he approaches both the Mexican and the Canadian relationship because clearly what he's trying to do, which I think is pretty obvious, is make America the mediator between trade between Canada and Mexico, where they will not have trade independent of the United States, and that he will reap the benefits of that, being the country wedged right in between them.
Again, we've covered on this show why a country that has the world reserve currency, right, and the amount of liquidity that it needs, and how it has to be essentially, the top or at least the second or third. And of course, America doesn't like it when it's second or third if it no longer has a significant industrial base as it used to have. That's why all the companies moved out in the first place. Okay, was to facilitate the situation that we're in now. There is a theory that this industrialization is going to be an industrialization to counter China, but not necessarily maybe for home products. We'll have to wait and see, but for military, right? Um, I mean, if if Trump didn't feel like if Trump felt like Russia was losing, Trump would not ask for a peace settlement. Okay, that wouldn't happen. And so it's not an ideal situation to have the world reserve currency to be the hegemonic power of the world, and then also, but to have all the industry at home. It won't work. China, that's why I think in some ways that it avoids wanting to be have the world reserve currency. Why this has to be like a basket of different countries that pour into it rather than one. It doesn't want that responsibility because it too will start to lose over time, over 2, 3 generations, its industry, right? And then you have to police all these countries. So, I get it. Maybe I don't know. Maybe Trump thinks he's really he keeps talking about we're going to bring back car manufacturing to America, and so on and so forth. He highlighted the guy from Taiwan who's going to set up a chip factory here, right?
Yeah, and the
Samsung already has one. It'll take a couple of years. I mean, they'll have to be training, but
yes.
I mean, let's see what the cost will be because I still would think the people who work in Taiwan work for a lot less than the people who are going to be working in America.
Oh, absolutely. And I think it was the it was either Honda or Toyota. It was one of the Japanese car companies.
Yes,
They got
I
that.
think it was Honda.
He got them to move their plant from Mexico to Indiana. So that was one of the other accomplishments that he touted at the speech. And with that being said, to return to your point, it is contradictory. You can't be the world reserve currency. You can't be the guarantor of international trade. You can't have this, I guess you could say, British style empire, this very maritime empire, and then have all the manufacturing at home. The style of empire that the United States has is fundamentally incompatible with a strong domestic industrial base. Now, you look at the kind of empire that, say, Russia or even China has, to return to your point, they are able to do that because they are. It's it's an empire, but it's not a colonial empire. Whereas the Americans employ maybe not a direct colonial model, but an indirect colonial model, where
Hmm,
and
hmm.
in order to keep the colonies in the good graces, you do have to throw them some red meat, and a lot of that is industry, and also in terms of having strong currency, you're going to need cheap goods. You're going to need the goods manufactured cheaply, and that's why you have what you have today because we had to move our financial model to a financialized economy versus say a more hard industry economy because of that.
Yeah.
And you even saw this with I don't want to take this too far, but with the British Empire in some cases where uh, certain industries existed in certain colonies because and some of that was just the logistics of the time, but that's how it had to work in order to maintain this sort of globe-spanning maritime empire. And there's just no way around it. Now, if the Americans wanted to pursue, say, a more continental or centralized empire, for example, like the Fortress North America model, then they could bring the industry home. They could have the continent fortress, and even maybe extend that all the way down to South America if they wanted to. Maybe not quite that far, but into a significant presence in South America. But as it stands now, if Trump wants to maintain the current American-led world order, which he seems to have signaled that yes, he wants to, despite some comments from say somebody like Rubio who has acknowledged the world is multipolar now, it like I said, you need to just simply move manufacturing to more friendly countries. And that's what we're seeing right now with the pressure for companies to move to Indonesia, Vietnam, Taiwan, not Thailand. But it would require such a radical restructuring of America's role in the world if you wanted to restore domestic manufacturing that, number one, it cannot be done in the course of one presidency, even with 8 years. Number two, it would be such a dramatic political change that, as I said previously, it would take decades and would also require a complete cleaning of house of American elite and one that are sympathetic to the idea that, okay, yes, America is going to be an empire. We're simply a powerful enough country where that's just going to be the case. We need to be a continental empire or an empire that's more centralized and close to home, where we throw around our influence in uh, Latin America and to our neighbors to the north. And maybe that's what Trump desires in his heart of hearts. But like I said, I think there would have to be some sort of major American loss. Perhaps if we engage in war with Iran and it goes just wrong in all the possible ways, then you could get the North American empire, so to speak. But as it stands now, it looks like Trump is, and pretty much the entirety of the American establishment is bent on maintaining the maritime empire. And if that's the
Hmm.
case, you're not going to get domestic manufacturing. It's one or the other. They are mutually exclusive.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I suppose that's really all I had in terms of just all the major stories of the week. Unless you had any last minute things.
And no, I really wanted to get that Vance story. I'm I'm good.
Hey,
That's him.
that you know what? That's it's good. We covered all our bases, and you get the analysis that you get nowhere else. And like I said, let never not be said that this is also not a
Yeah.
comedy show. Or,
Yeah. Did you know that Britain, up until you watched our show tonight, did you know that Britain is giving double-decker buses to Ukraine to drive up to recruit? No, you didn't know that. Only here.
Ang- Anglosphere society is what do I even say? Like, I'm not going to deny the problems of continental Europe because there are a lot, and I'm not going to downplay those. But the Anglosphere is just on such another level of debauched and deranged. I don't even know what to make of it.
I know.
Like, and you know, I know I live in it, and that I probably could emigrate, and I might actually have plans to one day. I'm not going to discuss my personal life to that extent on the show, but the Anglosphere is probably as hellish as a first world country, as first world countries can be. And like I said,
Yeah.
I don't want to downplay the problems on continental Europe. I know that the French and the Germans, especially when it comes to demographic issues, have their whole host of other issues. I know that in other parts of Europe that are not economically prosperous, where uh, there's not as many luxuries, and I can admit that. But in terms of social dynamics, in terms of the way society is structured, there is just something, like I said, the Anglosphere has figured out how to make the most hellish wealthy country possible. And it's a constant race between, particularly, you don't hear too much from the Australians or the New Zealanders. You hear a bit, but particularly between the Americans, Canadian, and British, like who can create the more deranged dystopian society, and that's what I feel like we're living in right now.
Hmm.
And it's a constant race to the bottom. And I would say right now the UK is probably winning that race, but America and Canada aren't that far behind. And believe me,
Oh yeah.
because I have to live here, I take no pleasure in saying that because I actually have some sentimental attachment to the country and the land that I live in. Believe it or not, despite my commentary on the show, I know it might sound contradictory, but it does make sense, at least to me. So I take no pleasure in necessarily saying any of this, but it's uh,
Yeah, I can respect that.
yeah, it's a constant race to the bottom, and I'll be honest that if I had sensible opportunity to leave, but like I said, I'm not going to discuss my personal life too much on this show because it's that's just it's pointless. Um, but yeah, the Anglosphere's toast is my point. Uh, if America pursues the North American empire model that isn't outright annexing Canada, but like a more of a fortress North America model, and implements some radical reforms, of course, politically speaking, then there might be something here. It's probably not going to be the society that we would envision as ideal, but it could be
Yeah.
tolerable. But I mean, the UK, I think, is just screwed. Like, I, with how much money and political capital they've invested in, particularly the Ukraine war, like this country has thrown what last ounces of power on the world stage, and even domestically, it had behind this Ukraine project. And it looked like it's going to blow up in their faces. Like, I think there's serious considerations of what will the situation in the UK look like in even just 10 years. And I think out of all of the European countries, they're probably in for the sharpest and most profound decline.
Yeah, yeah, certainly they've in many ways they're dealing with the shock of because in 100 years they went from the premier power of the world and now to like a middle state, um albeit still very wealthy and influential, and of course is has a very strong relationship with America, but ultimately you look at their nuclear arsenal, America calls the shots. And really, whatever kind of independence you might perceive from Starmer is basically because he's aligned with the Democrat Party.
Yeah. And he's made that crystal clear. He tried to get Kamala Harris in power. We all saw how that turned
Yeah,
out.
yeah.
And
The, there is a litmus test, I think, as to, you know, like so far, the if you consider, Apple investing half a bill, sorry, what was it, $500 billion, half a trillion
yes,
dollars in the U.S. And this Taiwanese company has moved over, et cetera, et cetera. So far, I haven't read any headlines about like military industrial complex increasing, but you don't see it in Europe either, right? All these Europeans saying they're going to, on top of what they are spending now, they're going to commit $800 billion. So countries like Germany, but not exclusively Germany, whose very cautious about increasing their debt ceiling, because of course they don't have that ability, like America being a world reserve currency, to just print infinite money. Uh, um, they, I mean, all there will be, flight in bonds, obviously, and that's happening now already, but for different reasons. But in any case, right? Um, so far, I'm not seeing a rapid improvement for the military-industrial complex in Europe. So far, I'm not seeing that. That might bode well for Trump's promises of, let's say, focusing on bringing back car manufacturing to America. Although I would presume it's going to be more expensive. He's not going to get like huge revenue from these tariffs in North America that are still haven't been um, ratified in a certain sense. They're not in action. So I would say that you could look at it that way. Or you could say you could look at it another way, which is what I said when we were talking with Geo last Friday, not this previous Friday, but the one before, and that is Trump might just be an intermediary president. It would probably befall on who's ever else in the White House in 2028 to do maybe a potential conflict or proxy war with China. But because I said on that show that America's not ready, they are not ready. So either it's going to be Iran, and Iran would be a very difficult nut to crack. Iran is, you could set it back, but you're not going to destroy it. It's not going to be like Iraq. Iran will be quite different.
I mean, their
And
best bet is to exploit the internal discontent and hope for
yeah,
a regime change, which I think is probably going to be what they do. Regime change by soft means, but I need to ask what you're suggesting is that we might get a nuclear Newsom in 2028.
so, sorry, could you repeat that again?
I said we might get nuclear Newsom in 2028.
Yeah, who knows? Yeah, that's right.
I'm gonna be a little sad in 2028 when we don't have Trump running an election for the first time in 12 years.
Yeah.
That is going to be a little bittersweet. I have to admit. But no, in all seriousness, on your points, yeah, I agree with you that Trump is probably an intermediary president, and even if he doesn't realize it, even if it's not his intention, he may be gearing up for an America that is prepared to engage in a wider conflict, whether that be in the Middle East or East Asia. I think Europe at this point is probably off the table because the Russians have made it clear that of their military capabilities and that they are able to that they're the most battle hardened military in the world. Is my point, and that pretty much nobody in Europe is going to stand a chance. Even maybe I shouldn't say even if they all unite forces, but it would be a difficult battle no matter which way you cut it, and that China is the rapidly ascending power. China is the main rival power, and while it might not be direct confrontation with China, let's say North Korea or even, like I said, somewhere like in the Philippines or Indonesia, or some sort of lesser conflict that involves China. Maybe not even necessarily directly with China or on Chinese soil.
Hmm.
That could be building up in the 2030s, and I think Taiwan is not going to resemble a Ukraine situation because the strategic depth of Taiwan is non-existent. If China wants to overrun the island, if they really want to commit the military force to that, they're going to do that, assuming they don't solve the situation
Yeah.
diplomatically. And there's no way the Americans or any other country can supply a years-long proxy war effort like they did in Ukraine. The logistics simply are not there. And
Yeah.
that if you're likely to get a situation like that, it's probably going to be another war in Korea. And while the stuff in South Korea seems clownish with Yoon and his attempted coup, you have to keep in mind, on a serious note, his entire basis for his coup was the purging of quote unquote pro North Korean elements, and that he's been very hawkish on the issue, and that his predecessor Moon Jae-in was actually the one who worked with Trump on the North Korean issue, actually helping arrange the meeting because the two Koreas were actually engaged in some preliminary negotiations before Trump met with Kim Jong Un, uh, and that was, like I said, in some part credit to the previous South Korean president. And now that you have Yoon here, he's restoked, I guess, what you could call anti-northern sentiments in a certain segment of the population where, and I think I talked about this a year and a half ago, where I still maintain if there's going to be a big conventional war in East Asia, it's going to be on the Korean Peninsula. It's not going to be directly with China.
Mm,
China may be
mm.
involved. China may even commit troops to it if need be. But we could see perhaps a reverse Ukraine scenario where it's the Americans fighting in South
What
Korea.
about the Philippines?
Philippines, I think, is also.
It's just the you think the logistics are too difficult?
I think when it comes to the islands, yes, logistics are too difficult, and that it would have to have something to do with um, land in East Asia. In which case, that also opens up the possibility because these are both countries that have had political turmoil in the past few years. Myanmar and Thailand as well.
Right. Because like the reason China's building these islands in the first place, not that America isn't, or not that America isn't resupplying and reactivating those islands that they had since World War II in the Pacific theater. But the reason the Chinese are doing this is because they fully expect the US to interdict their shipping lanes. Like if they cause something in Taiwan or as you say, Korea, or maybe some obscure island way south of Japan or the Philippines, it's that is when the Americans will try to interdict shipping lanes, or at least that's for now. It's a threat, and the Chinese are already sort of thinking ahead because the first time I started seeing these stories was about, I don't know, about 9 years ago, 8 years ago, maybe 10 years ago, but somewhere around there, somewhere around the time that Trump announced his presidency and won his first term back in 2016. So about a decade ago, roughly speaking. Uh, and in many ways, the war in Ukraine is also about America fully knows that Russia never had any intentions to invade Ukraine, to invade Europe or Poland or whatever. It's just an interdiction. They just cannot absorb or accept Europe um profiting and developing from cheap Russian energy. They just cannot accept that, and that's what this war is. It's an interdiction. It's a big one. It's messy. Looks just like World War II in many respects, or World War One, as some have said. But that's what it is. And so, yeah, those island chains. It's all about interdiction.
Yes, absolutely. And I do think that there's possibility for separate naval battles and skirmishes divorced or more separate from, say, a potential land war on other parts of East Asia or in the Asia Pacific. And you might also get, this is something that we've suggested before, a return to what is in effect high seas piracy across the world, where the U.S. Navy will become more belligerent because that's still probably the strongest asset the Americans have is their navy, and especially as China invests more in theirs, you could see, even if it's not direct conflict, where the American Navy becomes much more hostile to, say, Chinese shipping vessels, and in which case that might be the impetus for a conflict. It might be a direct trade war as opposed to, say, like tariffs and sanctions, but a direct trade war where you're stopping ships, you're hijacking ships. Uh, that is a real possibility. We could see where neither country really directly goes to war or engages in war, but there's constant naval harassment and constant naval engagement and skirmishes. I think it's a very real possibility as American supremacy wanes, while it still has a very strong navy, and while the Chinese build a navy that is able to at least confront the Americans in their own in China's own backyard.
Yeah. Some recent developments before before we end the podcast. This is crazy, but this is from the Syrian Christians Telegram channel, and ISIS cells have now begun killing HTS members in Deir ez-Zor. Maybe, maybe it wasn't just a name change.
And how
So,
they
for
fracture
people who
like
don't
that.
know, Deir ez-Zor is like basically western central Syria,
It's
quite a
actually
ways away.
it's on the border of Iraq for context.
Yeah, yeah, yes, that's a better way to put it. Not sort of on the southern side of the Euphrates.
You almost
And
said
the reason
Dnapper,
this
I
is
heard that.
happening, what's that?
You almost said Dnapper, I heard that.
Yeah. The reason this is happening is because HTS has moved so many of its forces to go fight against the Alawites that it just literally doesn't have enough to fight ISIS. Maybe America is stepping in to save the Alawites.
ISIS, the ever spurned lover. You took too many of our
Yeah,
members, and
yeah.
we're taking the fight back to you. This is intolerable. You aren't Salafists the way we are, so it's total jihad.
Insane, insane. These people. Also, the Alawite insurgents, the so-called Coastal Shield Brigade, has begun to execute some of the prisoners today because of the breakdown of negotiations with HTS. So those are my two headlines that just appeared now.
Well, I suppose none of that is shocking, but if peace cannot prevail, then I hope all the Al Qaeda and ISIS affiliates in Syria that we're supposed to accept as quote unquote legitimate and democratic all collapse under their own weight. That's all I can really say.
Mm-mm.
But that's all I had for the show as well, and I feel like we covered quite a bit of ground.
Yep.
So we'll certainly be back at some point next week, and you'll hear from us then. So thank you everyone for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.
Goodbye and take care.